Archaeological and linguistic studies indicate that the social structures of early Celtic societies were influenced by broader Indo-European patterns, particularly the tripartite division of society into priests, warriors, and commoners. Comparative analysis of classical sources and reconstructed Proto-Indo-European lexicons demonstrates a recurring hierarchical schema in which the priestly caste maintained religious, judicial, and educational authority. According to Dumazil, 1958, the tripartite model, expressed in multiple Indo-European societies, positioned the priesthood as intermediary between the divine and secular authorities, with explicit responsibility for ritual observances, codification of law, and transmission of oral tradition. Archaeological surveys at Latine sites in modern Switzerland and southern Germany reveal elite burials containing ritual paraphernalia, such as ceremonial torques, inscribed stele and iron implements, indicating the material status of priestly elites relative to warrior classes. Inscriptions on the Guddasaga stones and fragmentary Gaulish texts support the presence of a literate or semi-literate sacerdotal class operating within this social stratification. Linguistic reconstruction further corroborates the institutional role of the priestly caste. Terms such as Druids in Proto-Celtic, translated as oak knower, appear consistently across Celtic regions, reflecting specialized knowledge of ritual law and sacred sites. Contemporary analyses by Mallory, 1991, link these terms to broader Indo-European religious vocabulary, emphasizing continuity between Bronze Age Indo-European priesthoods and Iron Age Celtic Druids. In addition to ceremonial functions, these elites likely maintained jurisdiction over dispute resolution and legal administration. Classical authors such as Posidonius, writing in the late 2nd century BCE, describe Druids as adjudicators whose decisions carried binding authority, confirming that the institutional functions had deep genealogical and linguistic roots traceable to early Indo-European society. Material culture provides further evidence of priestly specialization. Excavations of elite Hallstatt tombs, such as the Hochdorf burial mound in Baden-Württemberg, c. 550 BCE, contained gold-plated ceremonial items, weaponry, and imported goods, suggesting the consolidation of ritual and political authority within a hereditary elite. Comparative analysis of contemporaneous Greek and Italic priesthoods demonstrates parallel structures in terms of hierarchical education, duration of apprenticeship, and ritual precision, indicating that the Celtic model followed broader patterns rather than developing in isolation. Secondary sources, including Cunliffe, 1997, argue that these institutional characteristics were standardized across Proto-Celtic Europe prior to Latine cultural expansion. The tripartite system also extended into economic administration. Archaeological surveys at Huneberg, c. 600 to 500 BCE, and other early Celtic settlements show evidence of centralized storage facilities and controlled redistribution of agricultural surplus, suggesting priestly oversight in addition to ritual leadership. Administrative reforms under the elite class likely involved codifying inheritance practices, regulating ritual taxation, and maintaining sacred sites, consistent with Indo-European precedent. Contemporary accounts of Celtic assemblies describe councils in which priestly voices held privileged status, indicating an integration of religious and political authority that would later define Druidic institutional functions. These assemblies often occurred at fixed seasonal intervals and were accompanied by ritualized adjudication, as indicated by fragmentary inscriptions and archaeological alignment of ceremonial spaces with solar and lunar cycles. Secondary textual sources, such as the work of Strabo, Geographica, c. 7 BCE, reference the durability of priestly influence across multiple tribal confederations, highlighting the cohesion of religious authority despite regional variation. Archaeological surveys at Gournay-sur-Gironde and other northern Gallic sites confirm the presence of standardized ritual installations, including timber temples and sacrificial enclosures, consistent with centralized oversight by the priestly elite. Military expeditions led by tribal chieftains often consulted these religious authorities for sanctioning campaigns, further demonstrating the functional integration of ritual and martial hierarchies. Administrative reforms under these early priestly systems codified ceremonial law and ensured the transmission of oral legal texts across successive generations, establishing the foundation for formalized Druidic education. By the late Hallstatt period, c. 500 BCE, the institutional framework of the priesthood, including its judicial, ritual, and educational responsibilities, had stabilized sufficiently to support regional expansion during the Latin period. Archaeological and textual evidence indicates that the tripartite system provided a durable template for social organization, which would later evolve into the fully developed Druidic institutions documented by classical authors. By this stage, ceremonial authority, legal administration, and oral knowledge were concentrated within a specialized elite, establishing the structural and functional parameters for the subsequent emergence of Druids in Celtic society. Archaeological investigations across northwestern Europe indicate that by the late 3rd and early 2nd millennium BCE, Bronze Age communities were establishing ritual landscapes with clearly defined ceremonial functions. Sites such as Stonehenge on the Salisbury Plain, circa 3100 to 1500 BCE, the Karnak alignments in Brittany, circa 3300 to 2000 BCE, and the Nebra Sky Disk site in Saxony-Anhalt, circa 1600 BCE, demonstrate sophisticated spatial organization of monumental structures with calendrical, astronomical, and ritual significance. Excavations at Stonehenge have revealed multiple construction phases, including the initial earthwork enclosure dating to 3100 BCE, the erection of the Sarsen Circle c. 2500 BCE, and subsequent rearrangements of bluestones until 1500 BCE. These phases indicate continuous, elite-directed activity over several centuries. According to archaeological surveys published by Parker Pearson et al., 2007, labor mobilization, material procurement, and ceremonial coordination required centralized oversight likely maintained by a priestly or ritual elite. In Brittany, the Karnak alignments consist of more than 3,000 standing stones arranged in linear rows extending over 4 kilometers, with construction dated between 3300 and 2000 BCE. Excavations at alignments such as Menek and Kermerio reveal stone settings oriented along solar and lunar axes, suggesting observation of seasonal cycles and celestial phenomena. These alignments were likely controlled and maintained by specialized groups who possessed detailed knowledge of astronomical and calendrical calculations. Surveys of burial mounds in the same region indicate that ritual leaders were interred with items such as bronze weapons, ornaments, and ceramic vessels, supporting the interpretation that ceremonial authority was accompanied by socio-political status. The maintenance and ritual use of these monumental sites required extensive memorization of ceremonial procedures, oral transmission of calendrical knowledge, and coordination of large labor forces, reflecting an early form of institutionalized intellectual authority. The Nebra Sky Disk, circa 1600 BCE, discovered near the Unstrut River, provides material evidence of Bronze Age elite knowledge systems. Composed of a bronze disk inlaid with gold representations of the sun, moon, and stars, the artifact is interpreted as an astronomical instrument for regulating agricultural and ritual calendars. Radiocarbon dating of associated artifacts, including swords, axes, and ceremonial blades, confirms contemporaneity with local elite burials. Analytical studies, Meller et al., 2002, indicate that such artifacts were part of broader ritual complexes controlled by specialized groups capable of calculating solstices, lunar cycles, and seasonal agricultural timing. The high level of precision demonstrated in the alignment of monumental structures and the symbolic representation of celestial phenomena implies the existence of a trained intellectual elite whose knowledge was transmitted orally and maintained across generations, predating written records by over a millennium. Evidence of ritual continuity is further supported by depositional practices at lakes, rivers, and bogs, including the Tollens Valley site in Mecklenburg-Vorpommern, circa 1300 BCE, and the Danish bog deposits at Jortspring and Illerup-Odal. Weapons, ceremonial items, and high-status ornaments were systematically deposited in wetlands, often in accordance with astronomical or seasonal cycles. Contemporary analyses, Free et al., 2015, suggest that these deposits were controlled by ritual specialists who regulated ceremonial observances and codified procedures through oral instruction. Such practices demonstrate a combination of religious, legal, and educational authority embedded within elite lineages, establishing operational continuity between the custodians of Bronze Age ritual knowledge and later Iron Age Druidic institutions. The requirement to memorize ceremonial procedures, maintain astronomical and seasonal records, and oversee complex labor organization necessitated long-term apprenticeship systems. Comparative studies of early Iron Age sites indicate that such apprenticeship often lasted decades and included instruction in ritual recitation, genealogical knowledge, and calendrical computation. Excavated items from Stonehenge, Karnak, and Nebra indicate centralized control over sacred knowledge and ritual performance, suggesting an institutionalized hierarchy in which authority was inherited or conferred through training. The replication of ceremonial patterns across geographically distant sites demonstrates the transmission of knowledge within an elite network spanning multiple regional communities, a model analogous to later Druidic oral schools. By the close of the Bronze Age, circa 1200 BCE, these sacred centers and the associated oral custodianship had established a durable framework for the codification of religious and social authority. Elite control of monumental construction, calendrical observation, and ritual practice provided a basis for hierarchical organization that persisted into the early Iron Age. The practices observed at Stonehenge, Karnak, and Nebra exemplify the institutional continuity and intellectual specialization that would later characterize Proto-Celtic polities of the Hallstatt period. By this stage, ceremonial authority, knowledge transmission, and social hierarchy were sufficiently formalized to support the emergence of early Druidic functions within subsequent Celtic societies. The Hallstatt period, c. 800 to 450 BCE, in Central Europe represents the crystallization of Proto-Celtic social hierarchies and ritual authority, providing a direct archaeological and institutional precursor to later Iron Age Druidic structures. Excavations at sites such as Hochdorf, Baden-Württemberg, c. 550 BCE, Glauberg, Hesse, c. 500 BCE, and Huenberg, Baden-Württemberg, c. 600 to 500 BCE, reveal elaborate tumulus burials and fortified settlements indicating pronounced social stratification. Elite interments frequently contained imported luxury goods, including Etruscan bronze vessels, amber ornaments, and finely wrought weaponry, alongside ritual objects such as ceremonial swords, decorated torques, and drinking vessels. These assemblages demonstrate the dual authority of Hallstatt elites in both secular and ritual spheres, consolidating leadership, religious control, and symbolic representation of power within a hereditary aristocracy. Settlement patterns indicate hierarchical organization at both regional and local levels. Huenberg, a fortified citadel on the upper Danube, exhibits evidence of multi-tiered urban planning, with inner enclosures for elite families and outer zones for specialized artisans and commoners. Archaeological surveys, Cunliffe, 1997, Harding, 2007, show evidence of controlled access, defensive ditches, and monumental gateways, suggesting central coordination by an elite ruling class. Contemporaneous burial mounds and cultic sites indicate that ritual authority was concentrated within these elites, with oversight of funerary, ceremonial, and seasonal observances. The presence of imported goods implies participation in long-distance trade networks, further reinforcing elite dominance and the institutionalization of social hierarchy. Priestly authority during the Hallstatt period is inferred from the differentiation of burial types, ceremonial artifacts, and ritual spaces. Elite tumuli such as Hochdorf contained couches, drinking sets, and bronze cauldrons associated with ceremonial feasting, implying the integration of ritual observances with socio-political hierarchy. Archaeological evidence from Glauberg, including stone statues, fortified enclosures, and sacrificial deposits, indicates ritual specialization by a distinct class capable of organizing and directing community-wide ceremonies. Comparative linguistic studies of early Celtic inscriptions, including the Lepontic scripts of northern Italy, c. 600 to 500 BCE, suggest specialized terminology for ritual officials and sacred assemblies, implying codified roles within an emerging priestly hierarchy. Military and administrative authority were frequently intertwined with ceremonial leadership. Hallstatt elite burials consistently contain weapons, including swords with elaborate hilts, shields, and spearheads, signifying martial as well as ritual competence. Evidence of controlled fortifications, such as Huenberg's palisades and glacis, indicates centralized planning and enforcement mechanisms, overseen by elite families or priestly intermediaries. Contemporary settlement surveys in the Danube and Rhine valleys suggest that elite oversight included regulation of agricultural production, storage of surplus goods, and redistribution for communal or ritual purposes. Seasonal festivals, feasts, and assembly gatherings were likely coordinated by these elites, demonstrating a proto-institutional framework for ceremonial authority and public administration. Artistic and symbolic practices further illustrate the consolidation of ritual authority. The emergence of Hallstatt princely art, including decorated swords, fibulae, and ceremonial chariots, reflects codified iconography intended to reinforce elite status and religious legitimacy. Monumental stone or timber enclosures, such as those at Glauberg and Magdalenberg, c. 600 to 500 BCE, served both ceremonial and commemorative functions, facilitating memory-keeping and oral transmission of elite genealogies, laws, and ritual procedures. Comparative analysis of similar Indo-European elites indicates that such symbolic expression was central to maintaining hierarchical authority and ritual knowledge across generations. By the late Hallstatt period, c. 500 BCE, these elite-controlled settlements, ceremonial centers, and ritual practices had stabilized sufficiently to support expansion and cultural homogenization during the Latin period. The integration of military, administrative, and ritual authority within elite lineages created a durable institutional framework for specialized knowledge transmission, codified ceremonial practice, and social regulation. The archaeological and linguistic evidence demonstrates continuity from Bronze Age sacred custodianship into Iron Age Proto-Celtic elites, establishing the material and institutional basis for the development of formal Druidic functions in subsequent centuries. By the end of the Hallstatt period, hierarchical social structures, ritual codification, and elite control of ceremonial knowledge provided the foundation for the emergence of the Latin culture and the fully institutionalized priestly roles described in classical sources. The Latin period, c. 450 to 100 BCE, represents a significant phase of cultural consolidation and territorial expansion among Iron Age Celtic populations across Central and Western Europe. Archaeological evidence indicates a widespread adoption of Latin artistic conventions, including curvilinear metalwork, decorated swords, fibulae, and ceremonial equipment, reflecting the diffusion of stylistic motifs from the Upper Danube and Bohemian regions into France, Switzerland, southern Germany, and the Upper Rhine Valley. Settlement surveys at sites such as Bibracht, Burgundy, c. 200 to 50 BCE, Huenberg, Baden-Württemberg, c. 500 to 400 BCE, and Mosching, Bavaria, c. 400 to 50 BCE, reveal increasingly complex urbanized centers with defensive fortifications, craft workshops, and ceremonial spaces. Stratigraphic analyses demonstrate successive construction phases and continuous occupation, suggesting coordinated social organization and elite oversight. The systematic distribution of imported goods, including Mediterranean amphorae, Greek ceramics, and Etruscan bronze vessels, indicates integration into long-distance trade networks controlled in part by ritual and political elites. Evidence of elite-controlled ritual activity is prominent at Latin ceremonial sites. Excavations at Glauberg, a fortified settlement with associated tumulus burials, have uncovered stone sculptures depicting mounted warriors and ritual figures, along with deposits of weapons, horse trappings, and ornamental objects. Radiocarbon dating of these contexts, c. 500 to 400 BCE, confirms contemporaneity with early Latin urbanization. Material assemblages suggest that ceremonial authority was closely linked to social and military leadership. Large assembly spaces and ritual enclosures, as identified through geophysical surveys, imply coordinated communal ceremonies, likely overseen by a hereditary elite. Such sites functioned as centers for the administration of law, adjudication of disputes, and organization of seasonal rituals. Comparative studies of the contemporaneous Celtic settlements along the Upper Danube indicate that the institutional responsibilities of the elite included both governance and the maintenance of ritual knowledge, forming a structural foundation analogous to classical descriptions of Druidic authority. Latin expansion facilitated the standardization of social, religious, and artistic practices across disparate Celtic polities. Material culture demonstrates uniformity in weapon typologies, decorative motifs, and ceremonial accoutrements across sites in Switzerland, southern Germany, and Gaul, implying coordinated transmission of technical and ritual knowledge. Elite-controlled workshops produced items with consistent iconography, suggesting formalized training systems under the supervision of senior ritual or craft specialists. Archaeological evidence from sites such as Latin, Switzerland, itself shows extensive deposition of high-status metalwork in lakes and rivers, including swords, scabbards, torques, and horse gear, interpreted as offerings regulated by priestly authorities. These depositions, often aligned with hydrological or seasonal cycles, indicate institutionalized ritual oversight and knowledge of cosmological patterns. The role of religious elites during this period extended to political mediation and legal functions. Classical sources, including Posidonius, c. 135 to 51 BCE, and Diodorus Siculus, 1st century BCE, describe Druids as adjudicators, educators, and intermediaries between tribal leaders and common populations. Archaeological indicators, including assembly enclosures at Moshing and Bibracht, correlate with these accounts, demonstrating that centralized ceremonial spaces functioned as loci of both religious and civic authority. Assemblies were conducted at regular intervals, often seasonally, and likely involved ritualized dispute resolution, oath-taking, and coordination of intertribal networks. The standardization of these practices across multiple Latin centers indicates a coherent, pan-Celtic framework for the management of ritual, legal, and social hierarchies. Military organization and elite oversight were integrated with ceremonial authority. Latin settlements contain evidence of armories, fortified gates, and strategically organized residential zones, reflecting central control by elite families with combined martial and ritual competence. Excavated weapons include longswords, spears, shields, and chariots, often decorated with motifs consistent with ceremonial and martial functions. Imported bronze and iron items demonstrate elite control over craft production, trade, and redistribution. The integration of ritual, administrative, and martial responsibilities established a systemic model in which priestly authority, social hierarchy, and political power were mutually reinforcing. By the mid-Latin period, c. 300 BCE, this framework facilitated the diffusion of Celtic polities across the Rhine, into Gaul, and toward the British Isles, forming an interconnected network of cultural, religious, and social practices. Elite control of ceremonial spaces, material culture, and oral knowledge transmission provided continuity for the development of formal Druidic roles described by classical authors. The institutional consolidation achieved during Latin expansion set the parameters for educational structures, ritual authority, and political influence that would characterize Druids in subsequent centuries. By the close of the Latin expansion, centralized ceremonial authority, elite-controlled transmission of knowledge, and standardized ritual practice had become enduring features of Celtic society, directly linking Hallstatt foundations to the classical Druidic system. Classical literary sources provide the earliest surviving written attestations of Druidic authority within Celtic societies. Hecataeus of Miletus, c. 550 to 476 BCE, references Celtic religious specialists in fragments preserved by later authors, indicating recognition of a structured priestly caste responsible for ritual observances and legal mediation. These descriptions suggest that even prior to extensive contact with Rome, Greek intellectuals perceived the Druids as a distinct social and political entity. Later, Posidonius of Apamea, c. 135 to 51 BCE, provides more detailed ethnographic accounts of Gaulish and British Druids, describing their function as educators, judicial authorities, and custodians of sacred knowledge. According to Strabo's Geographica, c. 7 BCE, Posidonius observed that Druids occupied a central role in resolving disputes, conducting ceremonies, and maintaining genealogical records, demonstrating an institutionalized hierarchy within Celtic polities. These accounts indicate that Druids were recognized internationally as elite intermediaries between tribal communities and deities, confirming both their social prominence and ritual responsibility. Posidonius details the educational and initiation structures of Druids, noting that training could extend over 20 years and focused on memorization of law, ritual, and cosmology. Oral transmission was emphasized, with reliance on recitation rather than written records, a practice that reinforced both the exclusivity of knowledge and the authority of the priesthood. Contemporary secondary analyses, Green, 1995, Cunliffe, 2005, indicate that these descriptions align with archaeological evidence of elite settlement hierarchies and ritual monuments across Gaul and Britain, suggesting institutional continuity from the Latine period. Druids exercised jurisdiction over criminal and civil matters, and their decisions carried obligatory authority across multiple tribal units, confirming that religious, legal, and political functions were combined within a single elite class. Greek and Roman sources also note the geographical scope of Druidic influence. Posidonius describes Druids in both continental Gaul and the British Isles, indicating that their authority extended across multiple tribal confederations and regional polities. Archaeological surveys of Latine settlements, including Bibracte, Burgundy, c. 200 to 50 BCE, and Mosching, Bavaria, c. 400 to 50 BCE, reveal assembly spaces and ritual enclosures consistent with these descriptions. Material evidence, including inscribed stelae, ceremonial metalwork, and standardized deposition of offerings, corroborates the textual testimony regarding centralized ritual and legal authority. Classical references emphasize that Druids were consulted on matters ranging from seasonal festivals to the sanctioning of military campaigns, demonstrating their integration into both civic and religious hierarchies. Hecataeus and Posidonius accounts also highlight the codification of law and ritual practice under Druidic oversight. Druids maintained oral legal codes and genealogical records that structured inheritance, succession, and intertribal agreements. Strabo notes that Druids held the power to adjudicate disputes and interpret customary law, reflecting an institutionalized system of jurisprudence embedded within Celtic society. Archaeological evidence supports this, with structured enclosures and designated ceremonial sites suggesting that communal decision-making and ritual observances were regulated by these elite authorities. The consistency of ceremonial patterns across geographically disparate sites further indicates that the Druidic institution functioned as a cohesive network rather than a series of isolated practices. In addition to social and juridical functions, classical sources describe the religious specialization of Druids. Sacrificial practices, seasonal ceremonies, and celestial observations were conducted under their authority. Caesar's later accounts, c. 58 to 50 BCE, in Commentarii de Bello Gallico confirm that Druids conducted both communal rituals and individual rites of passage, an institutional continuity traceable to earlier classical observations. Comparative studies of Greek and Roman ethnographies suggest that Druids, like other Indo-European priesthoods, combined education, jurisprudence, and religious authority into a single elite office. Archaeological surveys at ritual sites in Gaul, including Gournay-sur-Arronde and Ribe-Mont-sur-Ancre, demonstrate that elite-controlled ceremonial spaces were maintained over several centuries, supporting the textual evidence for sustained institutional authority. By the 1st century BCE, Greek and Roman sources collectively established the Druids as a literarily attested class with formalized responsibilities in education, law, and ritual. Their authority was recognized across multiple Celtic polities, corroborated by material culture and settlement archaeology. These accounts provide an external, contemporaneous validation of the Druidic institution, demonstrating that religious elites exercise structured, codified, and socially sanctioned authority. The description of oral training, legal jurisdiction, and ritual oversight situates the Druids within the wider pan-Celtic framework of Latine society and provides the foundation for understanding the subsequent formalization of Druidic juridical structures in late Iron Age Gaul and Britain. Evidence from classical texts and archaeological sources indicates that Druidic authority in late Latine and early Iron Age Celtic societies was highly structured, combining educational, juridical, and ritual hierarchies. According to Posidonius, c. 135 to 51 BCE, and later Julius Caesar, Commentarii de Bello Gallico, 58 to 50 BCE, the Druids organized themselves into formalized ranks based on length of training and expertise in law, ritual, and genealogical knowledge. Training could extend up to 20 years, during which candidates memorized extensive oral legal codes, ritual sequences, genealogical lineages, and astronomical cycles. This long-term apprenticeship created a distinct elite class whose authority derived from specialized knowledge rather than coercive power. Archaeological evidence from Latine fortified settlements, such as Bibracte, Burgundy, c. 200 to 50 BCE, and Mosching, Bavaria, c. 400 to 50 BCE, includes assembly enclosures and ritual spaces consistent with centralized educational and ceremonial activity, suggesting that instruction and initiation were embedded within the institutional fabric of these polities. Within this organizational structure, Druids maintained juridical authority across multiple tribal units. Caesar notes that Druids served as judges in civil disputes, with the power to adjudicate matters of inheritance, property, and intertribal agreements. Archaeological corroboration comes from structured assembly sites, such as enclosures at Ribeaumont-sur-Ancre, France, and Gournay-sur-Gironde, which exhibit standardized spatial arrangements suitable for deliberation, oath-taking, and ritual sanctioning of legal decisions. The oral law, transmitted through memorization and recitation, allowed Druids to preserve legal continuity across regions lacking written codification. This system ensured uniform application of customary law, maintained elite oversight, and reinforced the authority of the Druidic institution within the wider social hierarchy. Initiation and ceremonial hierarchy were closely linked to legal functions. Candidates progressed through stages of training, beginning with observational and memorization tasks, advancing to participation in ritual oversight, and ultimately attaining the capacity to adjudicate complex legal and ritual cases. Classical sources emphasize that only fully initiated Druids could preside over assemblies or interpret sacred law. Archaeological parallels include differentiation of burial types, elite grave goods, and monumental constructions, indicating hierarchical stratification and long-term investment in the reproduction of ritual authority. Comparative analyses with other Indo-European priesthoods suggest that the integration of legal, educational, and ritual functions was a recurring institutional pattern, reinforcing both social cohesion and elite legitimacy. The Druids' authority extended into political consultation and intertribal mediation. Caesar records that tribal leaders sought Druidic approval before military campaigns, treaties, or resource allocation, reflecting institutionalized integration of religious and juridical oversight. The combination of ritual authority, oral legal expertise, and educational monopoly allowed Druids to influence policy, enforce customary law, and regulate communal observances without reliance on coercive force. Archaeological surveys of Latine settlements demonstrate centralization of ceremonial sites, assembly spaces, and ritual deposits, supporting the textual evidence for coordinated, elite-directed governance. Depositions of high-status objects, often in lakes, rivers, or tumuli, are interpreted as ritual acts conducted under Druidic supervision, reinforcing social cohesion and compliance with legal norms. Druidic assemblies functioned as centers for both adjudication and instruction. Archaeological and textual evidence indicates that assemblies were conducted at regular seasonal intervals, often aligned with solar or lunar events, and attended by representatives of multiple tribal units. Decisions were recorded orally and transmitted through Druidic apprenticeship networks, creating a durable system of governance independent of written records. Spatial analysis of Latine ceremonial enclosures shows standardized arrangements, including raised platforms, concentric seating, and defined zones for ritual performance, supporting the hypothesis of formalized organizational structures for legal and educational activities. Such integration of space, ritual, and law demonstrates that Druidic authority was operational, centralized, and institutionally reinforced. By the 1st century BCE, the combination of hierarchical education, oral law, and judicial oversight established the Druids as essential actors in Celtic society. Their authority encompassed legal, ritual, and political spheres, functioning through knowledge, memorization, and ceremonial sanction rather than coercion. The institutional structure provided continuity across generations, linking Latin settlement hierarchies with the juridical, educational, and ritual functions described in classical accounts. Archaeological and textual evidence together confirm that Druidic authority operated within a coherent system, embedded in the administrative and ceremonial practices of Celtic polities. This framework directly informs the subsequent analysis of Gallic tribal structures and their interaction with Druidic institutions. The Latin cultural phase, conventionally dated from c. 450 BCE to c. 50 BCE, represents the zenith of pre-Roman Celtic civilization in Europe. Named after the lakeside site of Latin on Lake Neuchâtel in Switzerland, first excavated by Hansley Kopp in 1857 and later analyzed systematically by Otto Tischler and Joseph Dechelet, the culture denotes a standardized artistic and material expression spanning from the Atlantic coast to the Carpathian Basin. The material record, including metalwork, ceramics, weaponry, and ritual deposits, indicates a high degree of cultural uniformity underpinned by interconnected elite networks. Archaeological distributions at sites such as Bibracht in Burgundy, Glauberg in Hesse, and Huenberg in Baden-Württemberg demonstrate a consistent pattern of fortified oppida, centralized trade control, and ceremonial activity. This pan-regional uniformity reflects both the intensification of long-distance exchange networks and the institutionalization of ritual authority that transcended tribal boundaries. The Latin expansion was characterized by diffusion of artistic motifs and symbolic systems that suggest coordination among religious and artisanal elites. The curvilinear ornamentation typical of Latin art, including vegetal spirals, triscale forms, and stylized anthropomorphic imagery, occurs with remarkable consistency across thousands of kilometers, from Ireland to Anatolia. Metallurgical evidence shows shared technological practices, such as advanced iron forging and repoussé techniques in bronze, which required specialized knowledge and apprenticeship systems. These technical continuities imply regulated transmission of expertise, likely mediated by priestly or initiatory frameworks. Assemblages from sanctuaries like Gournay-sur-Arronde and Riebemont-sur-Ancre exhibit ritual deposition of weapons, animal remains, and crafted objects, indicating codified ceremonial practices. Such structured deposition patterns support the interpretation that Latin ritual systems operated under a professionalized religious class whose functions would later be described in classical texts as Druidic. Geographically, Latin influence expanded through both migration and cultural assimilation. From its Central European core, material culture spread into Gaul, northern Italy, the Iberian Peninsula, and the British Isles. The diffusion followed river systems such as the Rhine, Danube, and Seine, facilitating trade of iron goods, salt, amber, and wine amphorae. Settlement stratigraphy from oppida such as Mosching, Germany, and Heidelberg, Luxembourg, shows continuous occupation layers associated with intensified metallurgy, coin minting, and trade standardization. These developments parallel the consolidation of socio-political hierarchies, wherein elite classes coordinated exchange and ritual practices. The homogeneity of material and symbolic culture across disparate polities suggests that Latin elites, including ritual specialists, maintained interregional contact networks that institutionalized shared beliefs and ceremonial norms. Religious authority within the Latin world was embedded in these transregional elite systems. Archaeological data points to sanctuaries functioning as centers for both ritual and political coordination. Sites such as Gournay-sur-Arronde and the sanctuary complex at Entremont, southern France, show evidence of controlled access, standardized offerings, and structured enclosures, implying administration by organized priestly hierarchies. The consistency of ceremonial practice, human and animal sacrifice, deposition of weapons, votive feasting, indicates shared ritual grammar across the Latin sphere. These practices required custodians of liturgy, calendar calculation, and law, paralleling the functions attributed to Druids in later accounts. The integration of artistic, ritual, and legal authority produced an early institutional framework that facilitated both cultural cohesion and elite continuity. By the 4th and 3rd centuries BCE, Latin societies exhibited formalized stratification. Excavations at Hochdorf, Vix, and Glauberg reveal princely burials containing imported Mediterranean goods, chariots, and regalia, indicating long-distance trade relationships with Greek and Etruscan polities. The association of these tombs with ceremonial precincts and the recurrence of ritual iconography, torques, sun symbols, and triadic motifs underscore the ritual legitimation of elite power. The alignment of burial chambers and hill fort constructions with solstitial and equinoctial markers further suggests the integration of astronomical knowledge within elite authority structures. This integration of cosmology, craftsmanship, and governance underlines the systemic continuity between Latin religious elites and the later historically attested Druids. The Latin period also marks the consolidation of oppida-based political systems. These large fortified settlements, ranging from 20 to 100 hectares, functioned as administrative, military, and ceremonial hubs. Excavations at Montbeuvray, Bibracht, and Titelberg show complex urban planning, specialized production zones, and evidence of council assemblies. The coordination of these centers indicates the existence of supertribal institutions that mediated between warfare, trade, and religion. The uniform adoption of coinage standards and the proliferation of inscribed symbols, such as proto-alphabetic marks on pottery and weapons, imply administrative regulation of exchange and tribute systems. Religious elites, operating as custodians of law and ritual, would have facilitated intertribal legitimacy and conflict resolution, reinforcing the cohesion of Latin culture. By the late 3rd century BCE, external contact with Mediterranean civilizations intensified. Archaeological finds of Massaliote, Greek amphorae, and Roman imports at sites in Gaul, the Rhineland, and Britain document economic integration. Classical references to northern tribes by authors such as Hecataeus and Herodotus coincide with this period, suggesting that Latin elites had achieved sufficient political coherence to appear in external ethnographic accounts. These interactions stimulated the codification of internal hierarchies and the formalization of priestly offices. The ritual specialists who managed the transmission of knowledge, sanctioned law, and preserved cosmological systems likely evolved into the class identified as Druids in later textual sources. The cumulative evidence from Latin material culture, standardized art forms, ritual deposits, fortified oppida, and elite burials demonstrates that this cultural system functioned as a pan-Celtic framework of shared belief, law, and ceremonial authority. Its geographic and temporal scope ensured the transmission of institutional models that would define Celtic religious and juridical life through the 1st century BCE. As Mediterranean observers encountered these societies, their descriptions of structured priestly elites correspond directly to the institutional framework established during the Latin expansion. By the mid-1st century BCE, Latin uniformity provided the cultural substrate upon which external observers, particularly Greek and Roman ethnographers, identified the Druids as a distinct order of ritual and legal authorities. This period thus marks the culmination of a trans-regional system that merged artistry, governance, and theology into a coherent institutional structure. The earliest literary recognition of the Celtic priestly elite, retrospectively identified as Druids, appears in Greek ethnographic sources of the 5th to 1st centuries BCE. Hecataeus of Miletus, writing around 500 BCE, offered one of the first known references to a sacred island beyond the land of the Celts, inhabited by priests serving a deity associated with Apollo. Although fragmentary, this passage, preserved later by Diodorus Siculus, Bibliotheca Historica, v.23, establishes an early precedent for Greek awareness of organized northern religious systems. The island, possibly the Atlantic fringes or Britain, was described as the site of periodic ceremonies involving choral song, temple structures, and the observation of celestial phenomena. These details align archaeologically with solar-oriented megalithic and Iron Age ritual sites such as those at Salisbury Plain and Carnac, suggesting that Greek observers had received second-hand reports of northern ritual practices integrated into pan-regional trade narratives. Hecataeus's mention, though schematic, demonstrates that the existence of structured priestly authority north of the Alps was already an established concept within Greek geographical discourse by the early classical period. Subsequent accounts, notably those of Herodotus, c. 484 to 425 BCE, and Ephorus, c. 400 to 330 BCE, continued to depict the northern peoples as organized under hereditary elites who maintained both political and sacred authority. Although not using the term Druid, these sources described ritual functionaries responsible for prophecy, sacrifice, and law-giving among Hyperboreans and Keltoi, groups whose cultural markers correspond with later Latin populations. Such ethnographic generalizations reflected Mediterranean perceptions of order beyond the known world and conveyed the notion that northern societies possessed institutionalized religion. Archaeological findings, including standardized sanctuaries in Central Europe dated to the 4th and 3rd centuries BCE, corroborate this by evidencing the existence of fixed ceremonial centers controlled by elite specialists. The most detailed pre-Roman description of the Druids derives from the Stoic polymath Posidonius of Apamea c. 135 to 51 BCE, whose ethnographic observations during his travels in Gaul and Iberia became the principal source for later writers, including Diodorus, Strabo, and Caesar. Posidonius delineated a tripartite division of Celtic learned orders: the bards, who preserved oral poetry and genealogies; the vates, who conducted sacrifices and divination; and the Druids, who acted as philosophers, judges, and interpreters of natural and divine law. This structured taxonomy marks the first explicit recognition of Druids as an institutionalized elite with judicial, educational, and cosmological functions. Posidonius emphasized their authority in both civic and intertribal arbitration, stating that they possessed the power to halt warfare and to determine questions of inheritance and property. His account, though filtered through Stoic philosophical categories, reflects direct observation of organized priestly governance integrated into Gallic and Transalpine political systems. Posidonius' testimony was subsequently condensed and adapted by later Greco-Roman authors. Diodorus Siculus, writing in the 1st century BCE, relied heavily on Posidonius to describe the Druids as philosophers and theologians, esteemed for their wisdom and instruction. Strabo, in Geographica, Book 4, preserved the same tripartite classification and emphasized the Druids' role as natural philosophers and legal authorities, interpreting their doctrine as comparable to that of Pythagoras. The association of Druidic philosophy with Greek rational traditions suggests that Mediterranean authors perceived in the Druids not merely priests but a class of intellectuals with structured education and systematic thought. Archaeological correlation can be observed in the educational and ceremonial complexes at Opata such as Bibracte and Titelberg, where spatial organization implies administrative and didactic activity. These classical references collectively confirm the existence of an organized intellectual and ritual elite across Celtic Europe by the late Latin period. They also attest to the Druids' influence beyond strictly religious functions. According to Caesar, de Bello Gallico, 6.13-14, who drew upon Posidonius' ethnography, Druids presided over legal disputes, levied penalties, and oversaw religious instruction, forming a supertribal authority that mediated social order. Their exemption from military service and taxation, noted by Caesar, further indicates their institutionalized status as a separate juridical and educational estate. Comparison of Caesar's account with material evidence from ritual enclosures and fortified assembly centers demonstrates congruence between textual and archaeological records. Both point to a stratified, professional class embedded in governance structures. The consistency of these external observations across multiple centuries suggests that the Druidic institution was not an isolated phenomenon but a durable component of Celtic civilization. The geographic spread of these reports, from Hecataeus's sacred northern island to Posidonius' first-hand accounts in Gaul, reflects the extent of the Druids' cultural reach. The evolution of Greek and Roman perceptions, from distant wonder to ethnographic precision, parallels the growing intensity of Mediterranean contact with northern Europe through trade, colonization, and military engagement. These encounters provided Southern observers with empirical access to structured legal and religious systems, confirming that the Celtic world maintained its own intellectual hierarchy. By integrating Greek philosophical language with ethnographic observation, Posidonius and his successors transmitted an enduring image of the Druids as both philosophers and administrators of sacred law. Their recognition in external sources establishes the first literary validation of the Druidic order's societal influence and intellectual organization. Archaeological and textual evidence together position the Druids within the broader spectrum of Latin institutional complexity, bridging local tribal structures with trans-regional networks of knowledge and governance. By the close of the 1st century BCE, these classical attestations formed the foundation for all subsequent Roman accounts of Celtic religion and law. The next stage in this sequence, the juridical and educational organization of Druidic authority, illustrates how the order translated intellectual prestige into administrative power within Gallic and insular polities. By the late Latin period, c. 150 to 50 BCE, the Druidic institution had evolved into a formalized intellectual and legal order, operating within the political framework of Celtic Europe. Classical authorities, particularly Caesar, Commentarii de Bello Gallico, 6.13-14, Strabo, Geographica, 4.4.4, and Diodorus Siculus, Bibliotheca Historica, v.31-32, attest that the Druids occupied a distinct social stratum defined by learning, adjudication, and ritual governance. Their power derived from the preservation of oral law, mastery of genealogical and astronomical knowledge, and the capacity to interpret divine will in civic and legal matters. In this capacity, they maintained law and order through knowledge rather than coercion, functioning simultaneously as educators, judges, and legislators within a decentralized but coherent institutional network. The educational system of the Druids was the cornerstone of their authority. According to Caesar, training could last up to 20 years, conducted entirely through oral instruction. The curriculum included theology, law, natural philosophy, history, cosmology, and poetic forms. Memorization was central. The Druids deliberately avoided writing, possibly to protect their corpus of knowledge from external access or distortion. This practice finds indirect support in the archaeological record. Latin inscriptions are exceedingly rare compared to the material evidence of organized sanctuaries and assembly sites, implying that communication of legal and ritual formulae was intentionally oral and exclusive. The extended period of education and restricted access ensured that only a small elite achieved full initiation, reinforcing a closed intellectual hierarchy. The hierarchical structure of the Druidic order itself is partially reconstructible from both textual and material evidence. Posidonius' tripartite model bards, vates, and druids suggests vertical specialization within an overarching institution. The bards maintained oral tradition and genealogy. The vates supervised ritual, sacrifice, and divination, and the druids exercised judicial and philosophical authority. Within this framework, druids represented the apex of knowledge and decision-making, possessing both spiritual and legal jurisdiction. Excavations of ceremonial and administrative centers such as Bibracht, Gournay-sur-Arronde, and Teidelberg reveal spatial segmentation consistent with differentiated roles: sacred enclosures, council platforms, and ritual altars, implying institutionalized coordination between ritual and legal activities. Judicial authority formed a principal aspect of Druidic function. Caesar records that Druids adjudicated virtually all disputes, whether between individuals or between tribes, determining compensation, punishment, and restitution. Those who disobeyed their decrees were subject to interdictio sacrificium, exclusion from religious participation, which effectively severed offenders from the civic body. This penalty, functioning as both spiritual and social ostracism, demonstrates that Druidic rulings carried enforceable authority even in the absence of standing armies or centralized states. Archaeological corroboration exists in the form of structured assembly sites, such as the sanctuaries at Gournay and Ribe-Mont-sur-Ancre, which show evidence of formalized gatherings and oath-taking rituals. The ceremonial deposition of weaponry and human remains within these contexts likely corresponded to acts of judicial sanction and reconciliation. Oral law served as the medium of continuity across regions. Its memorization ensured consistent legal interpretation within societies lacking script-based administration. Comparative analysis with early Irish and Welsh legal texts, such as the Brehon Laws and Cyfraith Hywel Dda, though recorded much later, indicates that Indo-European legal traditions preserved through oral transmission often codified property rights, inheritance, and dispute resolution mechanisms through formulaic recitation and ritualized adjudication. In this context, the Druids functioned as custodians of collective memory, guaranteeing both the preservation and uniform application of law across Celtic Europe. Their authority rested not on lineage but on demonstrated mastery of inherited knowledge. Initiation procedures into the Druidic class, though not directly described in classical sources, can be inferred through analogy and archaeological context. The existence of votive deposits of writing tablets, weaponry, and ritual paraphernalia in sanctuaries implies ceremonial progression from apprenticeship to full initiation. The absence of public record or monumental commemoration of individual Druids further underscores the institution's emphasis on continuity of office rather than personal prominence. Authority was cumulative, institutional, and transmitted through oral succession. This model created a transgenerational bureaucracy of knowledge capable of operating independently of dynastic or tribal politics. The Druids' educational monopoly extended into governance. Caesar's narrative of intertribal assemblies under Druidic supervision suggests that they acted as mediators and arbiters among Gallic polities. Their ability to suspend warfare through ritual injunctions illustrates the integration of legal and religious authority. Archaeological evidence of regional gathering sites, such as the plateau sanctuaries of the Seine Basin and the Oppidum councils of the Auvergne, indicates formal venues for legislative and judicial activity. These locations, often aligned with solar or lunar cycles, further connect Druidic legal authority to astronomical and ritual timekeeping, reinforcing their dual administrative and cosmological role. The Druids' influence extended to the control of knowledge systems, particularly in calendrical regulation and ritual timing. Caesar records that they studied the stars, the size of the world, and the power of the immortal gods. This description aligns with archaeological evidence of solar and lunar alignments in Latin religious architecture, such as the Gournay Sanctuary and the Coligny Calendar, discovered in Ain, France. An inscribed bronze tablet from the 1st century BCE that records a sophisticated lunisolar system. Although written in Latin script, its formulaic structure and terminology reflect the transmission of earlier oral astronomical traditions, almost certainly maintained by Druidic scholars. By the end of the Latin period, the Druids had consolidated a unique socio-political role that combined judiciary, educational, and religious authority. Their institutions maintained social order through intellectual consensus rather than force, ensuring continuity across fragmented tribal polities. Archaeological, linguistic, and textual evidence converge to depict them as administrators of law and custodians of tradition, operating within a well-defined hierarchy and governed by collective rather than personal authority. By the 1st century BCE, this system was firmly embedded in the Gallic world that Rome would soon encounter. The next stage, the integration of Druidic institutions into Gallic tribal structures, reveals how these intellectual elites operated within, and sometimes above, the political hierarchies of pre-conquest Gaul. The institutional hierarchy and oral legal systems of the Druids formed the administrative backbone of Celtic governance. The next section examines their role within Gallic tribal organization, showing how Druidic authority interfaced with chieftainship, warfare, and regional politics in the century preceding Roman conquest. By the late 5th century BCE, the Gaulish world was a mosaic of interrelated tribes bound by linguistic, religious, and commercial ties extending from the Atlantic coast to the upper Danube. Archaeological distributions of Latin-type artifacts indicate a high level of cultural uniformity across this expanse, though political organization remained decentralized. Classical sources such as Caesar's Commentarii de Bello Gallico describe over 60 tribal polities, including the Aedui, Arverni, Sequani, and Remi, each maintaining its own magistrates, warrior aristocracy, and priestly orders. The term confederation is employed by modern historians to designate the periodic assemblies of these tribes, federative councils formed to arbitrate disputes, coordinate military campaigns, and ratify treaties. These gatherings, often held at sanctified groves or oppida near river confluences, operated under ritual regulation overseen by Druids, who possessed authority over legal procedure and religious observance. The Eguin Confederation, centered at Bibracte, offers a model of this polyethnic organization. According to Caesar, I.16, the Aedui held the title of fratres consanguinii populi Romani prior to the Gallic Wars, suggesting a recognized primacy within the intertribal network. Their governing senate, consisting of approximately 600 nobles, was advised by a priestly body that preserved ancestral law through oral tradition. In these contexts, Druids served as arbiters and counselors, ensuring compliance with divine sanction. Evidence from sanctuaries such as Gournay-sur-Arronde and Ribemont-sur-Ancre indicates ritualized assembly activity marked by offerings of weapons and animal sacrifice, suggesting the conjunction of civic and religious functions. The deposition of war spoils into sacred enclosures parallels Mediterranean practices of votive dedication, but within an indigenous legal religious framework maintained by Druidic ritual. Contemporary ethnographic analogies drawn from Posidonius, cited in later summaries by Diodorus Siculus and Strabo, describe Gallic assemblies that combined political deliberation with religious ceremony. Druids presided over oath-taking, administered sacrificial rites, and invoked deities as witnesses to confederation decisions. In the absence of written law, legal memory was sustained through memorized formulae, recited at these gatherings to reaffirm intertribal compacts. The preservation of precedents depended upon the intellectual monopoly of the Druidic class, whose oral instruction, spanning decades, produced specialists capable of reciting genealogies, property claims, and ritual codes. This dual function, sacerdotal and juridical, rendered Druids indispensable to the cohesion of the Gaulish polity. Intertribal diplomacy in Gaul thus operated through a framework of sacral legitimacy. When the Helvetii proposed migration in 58 BCE, Caesar records, I.57, that their plans were sanctioned by communal deliberation, according to ancestral custom, implying priestly mediation in consent. The Arverni, under leaders such as Celtillus and his son Vercingetorix, mobilized not merely through martial alliances but through ideological unity articulated by Druidic council. The capacity of these priestly figures to influence collective will demonstrates their embeddedness in decision-making processes at the confederation level. They functioned as institutional custodians, ensuring that tribal sovereignty conformed to ritual norms and Pan-Gaulish identity. Excavations at the Montbeuvray Oppidum, identified as ancient Bibracte, reveal evidence of structured civic planning, coin minting, and imported Mediterranean goods, reflecting a socio-political complexity consistent with organized priestly administration. The coexistence of aristocratic estates and communal sanctuaries implies coordination between warrior elites and ritual authorities. Scholars such as Christian Gaudineau and Barry Cunliffe have argued that these federations possessed embryonic state characteristics, with the Druids acting as the ideological and judicial core rather than a peripheral priesthood. Their authority transcended kin boundaries, granting them jurisdiction over disputes involving different tribal territories. By the mid-1st century BCE, the convergence of religious and political institutions had produced a semi-formalized assembly culture, possibly reflected in Caesar's statement, 6.13, that Druids met annually in the territory of the Carnutes, in a consecrated place held in the estimation of all Gaul. This assembly, situated near modern Chartres, functioned as a supertribal council of judgment. It exemplified the capacity of the Druidic institution to integrate a polyethnic region through legal standardization and ritual coherence. Decisions made there possessed moral and social binding force, independent of any central government. The Druidic oversight of such assemblies suggests a tiered system of governance in which priestly authority compensated for the absence of written constitutions or codified law. They maintained the integrity of alliances, supervised the transition of leadership, and enforced penalties for sacrilege or treachery. The uniformity of ritual form across distant tribes, from Armorica to the Upper Rhine, indicates communication networks sustained by these learned specialists. The collective religious framework of Gaul thereby constituted an intertribal institution whose stability depended on the intellectual infrastructure preserved by the Druids. By 60 BCE, the confluence of confederate politics, sacred law, and priestly arbitration had generated a cohesive though non-centralized system of governance. The Druids' presence at assemblies, their power of excommunication, and their recognized jurisdiction across tribal borders rendered them the principal mediators of Gallic unity. Their influence extended beyond ritual into the practical administration of justice and diplomacy, forming the institutional bridge between autonomous tribal governance and collective identity. The consolidation of Druidic authority within the confederations established the conditions for a structured educational system that transmitted law and ritual memory across generations, sustaining unity through oral tradition. Knowledge within the Gallic world was transmitted through a closed pedagogical system controlled by the Druids. Classical testimony, particularly Caesar's Commentarii de Bello Gallico, 6.13-14, provides the most detailed account of their educational hierarchy. They are said to learn by heart a great number of verses. Consequently, some remain in training for 20 years. This extended duration, corroborated by later references in Lucan's Pharsalia, I.450-60, reflects a deliberate process of intellectual formation intended to preserve sacred and legal doctrine through oral means. The absence of written records in this tradition was not due to illiteracy, since the Gauls employed the Greek alphabet for mundane purposes, but to a conscious prohibition on inscribing sacred knowledge. Caesar attributes this to a fear that it may be divulged to the common people, and that dependence on writing might weaken the discipline of memory. Archaeological contexts across Gaul and Britain indicate the existence of regional sanctuaries and training centers functioning as religious schools. Sites such as Rocapertis, Gournay-sur-Arronde, and the Oppidum of Montbeuvray exhibit spatial arrangements combining ritual enclosures, votive deposits, and assembly areas, suggesting an educational as well as ceremonial function. These were not institutions in the architectural sense of later academies but ritual precincts where instruction, initiation, and adjudication occurred. Inscriptions from the later Roman period, referencing magistry and sacerdotes among Gallic elites, may represent survivals or adaptations of this Druidic instructional structure under imperial administration. The educational process was highly stratified. Entry required aristocratic lineage or patronage, indicating that Druidic instruction served as a means of elite reproduction. Pupils, commonly the sons of nobles, underwent a multi-stage curriculum encompassing theology, jurisprudence, cosmology, and oral literature. Early instruction focused on the memorization of formulaic verses, which encoded both moral precepts and technical knowledge. The mnemonic system relied on rhythmic recitation, repetition, and the use of metrical cadences to structure extensive bodies of text. Ethnographic parallels drawn from early medieval Irish filled schools suggest that syllabic counting, alliteration, and patterned assonance served as mnemonic scaffolds long before written texts appeared. Advanced stages of training introduced cosmological and metaphysical doctrines. Caesar records that Druids discuss many things concerning the stars and their movement, the size of the world and of the earth, the nature of things, and the power and authority of the immortal gods. This passage implies an organized curriculum of natural philosophy parallel to Greek and Hellenistic systems. The emphasis on astronomy and natural order reflects an intellectual continuity between the ritual calendar and the governance of agricultural and legal cycles. Archaeological evidence, particularly the alignment of sanctuaries such as Gournay and Ribemont with solar events, demonstrates that astronomical observation held ritual significance, reinforcing the pedagogical link between cosmology and social order. Druidic instruction was also juridical. Trainees were required to master precedents, oaths, and oral codes that governed inheritance, boundaries, and recompense. The preservation of these legal formulae through trained memory ensured uniformity across tribal jurisdictions. The system depended upon precise verbal transmission, for which mnemonic devices were meticulously maintained. Studies of Celtic poetic meters, such as the Rosc and Diabyde forms preserved in later Irish tradition, suggest a formalized linguistic discipline inherited from this earlier Druidic scholasticism. The Druidic educational model extended beyond intellectual cultivation to ritual authority. Instruction included the recitation of sacrificial rites, divination protocols, and calendrical computation. The Coligny calendar, discovered in eastern Gaul and dated to the 1st century CE, provides material evidence for such computational expertise. Its intricate lunisolar calculations imply professional astronomical knowledge maintained within priestly circles. Though inscribed in Latin letters, the structure of the calendar, with its 62 lunar months and intercalary cycles, reflects an indigenous tradition of timekeeping requiring advanced training to interpret and apply. This calendaric precision reinforced the Druidic role as regulators of ritual time and agricultural sequence. Pedagogical organization appears to have been regionally networked. Classical sources suggest that students traveled to specific centers renowned for instruction. According to later medieval accounts, such as the Historia Brittonum, Britain was regarded as a center of Druidic learning to which students from Gaul traveled for higher initiation. While post-classical and retrospective, these testimonies align with Caesar's statement that those wishing to study the doctrine in greater depth generally proceed to Britain. The existence of this transmarine academic exchange implies a hierarchical distribution of knowledge, with Britain serving as the doctrinal heartland and continental Gaul as its administrative sphere. The pedagogical duration, reported as extending up to 20 years, suggests both the complexity of the corpus and the moral discipline required for its retention. The oral method demanded intense repetition and isolation from secular distractions. Initiates were bound by ritual secrecy. Failure to preserve accuracy or disclosure of esoteric material could entail excommunication from the sacred order. The exclusivity of access maintained the intellectual prestige of the Druids and reinforced their control over historical, genealogical, and cosmological information. Through this monopoly of learning, they functioned as archivists of collective memory in societies that otherwise lacked documentary continuity. Comparative evidence from early Celtic epigraphy, such as the Lepontic and Gaulish inscriptions, indicates that literacy coexisted with orality. However, written communication served trade, commemoration, or political record, not instruction in sacred or philosophical doctrine. The Druidic system thus institutionalized an oral monopoly, transforming memory into an instrument of social governance. Their ability to reproduce law, ritual, and myth across generations through disciplined oral pedagogy made them indispensable to Gallic cohesion. By the late 1st century BCE, the Druidic schools had become integral to the maintenance of political order and cultural identity. Their graduates occupied advisory positions in tribal courts, supervised religious observances, and mediated in legal disputes. The network of sacred learning constituted a pan-Celtic intellectual infrastructure that transcended tribal divisions. It preserved continuity amid the rapid socio-political transformations preceding Roman conquest. The durability of this educational and religious network brought Druids into direct contact and eventual conflict with Roman administrative systems, inaugurating the era of confrontation and adaptation that would redefine their institutional role in the Gallic provinces. Julius Caesar's Commentarii de Bello Gallico, composed between 58 and 51 BCE, remains the principal ethnographic testimony concerning the Druids of Gaul. Written in the context of his military campaigns, it documents the institutional structure of Gallic society with particular attention to the role of priestly elites. In Book 6, Caesar distinguishes 3 principal social orders: the Druids, the Knights, Equites, and the common people, plebs. Among these, the Druids held supreme authority in religious, legal, and educational domains. Their functions extended far beyond ritual to encompass mediation between tribes, the administration of justice, and the management of communal revenues. Caesar's description presents them as the intellectual and administrative nucleus of Celtic civilization, performing functions that in Rome were distributed among priests, magistrates, and jurists. According to de Bello Gallico 6.13-14, the Druids were charged with the conduct of public and private sacrifices and the interpretation of all questions of religion. Their judgments were binding across tribal boundaries, and they arbitrated both criminal and civil disputes. The power of excommunication, interdictio sacrificiis, by which individuals were barred from religious rites and social participation, conferred a mechanism of coercion without military enforcement. Caesar reports that those so prohibited were regarded as impious and accursed, excluded from all social interaction, and deprived of legal protection. This authority to regulate inclusion within the social body demonstrates the Druids' central role in maintaining civic discipline and moral order. The Druids also presided over annual assemblies in the territory of the Carnutes, considered the geographical center of Gaul. These gatherings, attended by representatives from all tribes, functioned as both a religious synod and a judicial council. Caesar identifies this assembly as the locus for adjudicating intertribal disputes and resolving questions of law and precedent. The location, held to be the most sacred spot in the land, likely refers to the region of modern Chartres, corroborated by archaeological remains of extensive ritual deposits in the Loire Basin. The institutional continuity of these assemblies demonstrates a federative structure comparable to political confederations but grounded in religious authority. The fiscal dimension of Druidic power, though less explicitly discussed by Caesar, is inferred from their control over sacrificial offerings and communal wealth. The centralization of tribute through sacred institutions provided resources for religious construction, feasting, and redistribution. Later Roman sources, such as Strabo, Geography 4.4.4, confirm that Druids participated in the collection and allocation of communal funds, acting in effect as custodians of temple treasuries. The circulation of wealth through sanctuaries, evidenced by vast hoards of weapons, coins, and bronze statuary deposited at sites such as Gournay-sur-Arronde and Ribe-Mont-sur-Ancre, illustrates the integration of religious authority with economic management. These deposits represent both ritual dedication and the material foundation of Druidic influence. Caesar's account also emphasizes the Druids' monopoly over education. He reports that young men of rank were sent to study under their supervision, learning a great number of verses that encompass theology, law, and natural philosophy. This educational exclusivity reinforced their control over historical record and collective memory. Caesar's claim that Druidic students abstained from writing sacred teachings, preferring oral retention, is often interpreted as evidence of a systematic pedagogical discipline designed to maintain secrecy and cohesion among the elite. Through such instruction, the Druids perpetuated ideological unity across ethnically diverse Gallic tribes. Politically, the Druids functioned as mediators and administrators of confederate governance. They advised chieftains, supervised treaties, and coordinated intertribal relations. In Caesar's narrative, their authority occasionally exceeded that of individual kings, particularly in disputes where the sanction of religious legitimacy was required. The commentary described Druids as both arbiters of war and custodians of peace. Before major conflicts, they determined ritual auspices and declared favorable times for engagement. Their role in the regulation of warfare linked them directly to the maintenance of social equilibrium. Strabo, writing in the early 1st century CE, corroborates this dual function, describing the Druids as philosophers and theologians who also presided over public and private disputes. While Caesar's portrayal is filtered through the lens of Roman administrative logic, its consistency with other contemporary accounts, such as Diodorus Siculus, Bibliotheca Historica v.2831, and Pomponius Mela, Dechoragraphia 3.2.18, supports the interpretation of the Druids as an organized priestly bureaucracy. Diodorus identifies 3 categories of learned men among the Celts: bards, vates, and druids. Of these, the Druids occupied the highest echelon, combining theological, legal, and philosophical functions. Mela similarly records that they claimed knowledge of the gods and of their nature, and that their judgments commanded universal obedience. This convergence of testimonies indicates a recognized institutional framework rather than regional variation. The political reach of the Druids, as presented by Caesar, extended beyond individual polities to encompass a pan-Gallic dimension. His mention of Britain as the central seat of Druidic doctrine suggests a transnational network of religious and intellectual exchange. This network operated as a cultural infrastructure facilitating unity among disparate tribes lacking centralized monarchy. Through councils, tribunals, and ritual assemblies, the Druids maintained a functional confederacy that underpinned both political deliberation and military coordination. Caesar's record, while serving his propagandistic purpose of justifying Roman intervention, inadvertently provides the most detailed reconstruction of pre-conquest Gallic governance. By delineating the Druids' functions in law, education, taxation, and diplomacy, he describes a society governed through moral and ritual authority rather than codified institutions. The Druids' capacity to mobilize consent and enforce compliance without standing armies or bureaucratic apparatus exemplifies an early form of sacerdotal governance. The Roman observation that Britain served as the primary center of Druidic instruction establishes the next chronological phase, tracing the transference and development of Druidic authority within the insular context of late Iron Age Britain, where contact with Rome would precipitate the first direct suppression of the order. Prior to the Roman conquest, Britain was divided into numerous tribal polities whose boundaries were delineated by river valleys, upland ridges, and coastlines. Archaeological surveys, notably those compiled by Barry Cunliffe and Martin Millett, indicate a mosaic of socio-political units ranging from small kin-based chiefdoms to larger confederations. The southern lowlands, with fertile chalk downs and access to continental trade, were dominated by tribes such as the Atrebates, Catavilani, and Trinovants, while upland zones in the west and north were held by the Debuni, Silures, Brigantes, and Caledonii. The political structure was decentralized. Authority rested with chieftains supported by warrior aristocracies and priestly elites. Within this framework, the Druids functioned as mediators, adjudicators, and ritual specialists, maintaining cohesion through religious law and ceremonial observance. Insular religious practice in this pre-Roman context exhibited both continuity with and divergence from continental Celtic forms. The use of open-air sanctuaries, sacred groves, and natural features as loci of worship distinguished British cultic geography. Excavations at Hayling Island, Harlow, and South Cadbury reveal ritual enclosures lacking permanent temples but containing votive pits, timber post rings, and deposits of animal bone, weaponry, and imported amphorae. These sites suggest recurring ritual gatherings rather than fixed priestly residences. Classical testimony, particularly Tacitus' Annals 14.30, later confirms that sacred groves were central to Druidic ceremony, functioning as both ritual stage and seat of instruction. The persistent use of oak groves and liminal landscapes, rivers, lakes, and marshes, indicates a cosmology in which natural environments themselves were sacralized and hierarchically organized. Material evidence from Iron Age Britain further demonstrates the institutional role of religious specialists. The discovery of structured deposits, torques, cauldrons, chariot fittings, and human remains in rivers such as the Thames and Witham implies formalized sacrificial practice overseen by ritual authorities. The Llyn Cerrig Bach deposit on Anglesey, dated to the 2nd to 1st centuries BCE, contained weapons, chains, and chariot gear intentionally placed in a lake, suggesting both martial and votive significance. Such large-scale dedications would have required coordination by an organized religious elite. The repetition of these acts across centuries implies continuity of priestly oversight and standardized ritual forms, consistent with the Druidic framework recorded by later classical observers. The insular Druids operated within an ecological and political setting distinct from continental Gaul. Britain's relative isolation fostered regional variation in ritual form and hierarchy. Whereas continental Druids convened Pan-Gallic assemblies, insular practice appears more localized, oriented around tribal centers and regional sanctuaries. Excavations at Stanwick, Brigantian territory, and Maiden Castle, Duro-Trigan territory, reveal internal enclosures interpreted as ceremonial precincts, with deposits of feasting debris and symbolic items. These centers likely hosted periodic gatherings that reinforced social cohesion and political alliance. Druidic participation in these assemblies ensured uniform interpretation of law, timekeeping, and sacrifice across dispersed tribal zones. The cultic system in Britain maintained a dual function: ritual appeasement of deities and the legitimation of political authority. Tribal rulers derived status through association with sacred genealogies and ceremonial endorsement by priestly authorities. bronze mirrors, torques, and regalia found in elite burials at Arras, Lexden, and Birdlip suggest the ceremonial integration of kingship and religion. Druidic sanction, expressed through ritual initiation and divination, validated succession and treaty. Strabo's reference to Druids as concerned also with philosophy and the natural order finds archaeological reflection in the alignment of sanctuaries with astronomical phenomena, such as the solstitial orientations identified at sites in Wiltshire and Norfolk. The maintenance of calendrical observances, including periodic festivals and fire rites, reinforced Druidic authority as regulators of cosmic and civic order. Epigraphic absence from Iron Age Britain, contrasted with Gaulish inscriptions, reinforces the oral and ceremonial character of insular religious administration. The transmission of law and genealogy occurred through recitation in communal assemblies. Comparative evidence from later Irish sources, particularly the Sanchez Mar legal compilation and the Imacallum in Dothwarid, indicates a professional class of jurispriests who memorized precedents and genealogies. While these texts are centuries later, their structural features mirror the oral legal systems Caesar and Tacitus attribute to the Druids. Such continuity underscores the likelihood that British Druids maintained similar mnemonic institutions to preserve social norms and property laws. By the 1st century BCE, trade with continental Gaul intensified, introducing new cultural materials and possibly reinforcing religious uniformity. Imports of wine amphorae, Mediterranean ceramics, and coinage at southern sites indicate participation in transchannel networks that also facilitated the circulation of priestly knowledge. Caesar's assertion that students from Gaul traveled to Britain for Druidic instruction situates the island as an intellectual nucleus. This view accords with the archaeological richness of Anglesey, Mona, and the Severn Estuary Zone, regions later identified by Roman sources as centers of resistance and religious power. The accumulation of votive deposits, the density of hill fort sanctuaries, and the persistence of non-urban ritual landscapes support the characterization of Britain as both a doctrinal repository and a conservative stronghold of Druidic authority. The evidence therefore portrays a system in which religious specialists maintained an intricate balance between local autonomy and overarching doctrinal unity. Their influence permeated tribal councils, legal adjudication, and ritual timekeeping, ensuring societal stability within a fragmented political geography. The Druidic network, sustained through oral transmission and periodic assemblies, constituted a super-tribal institution that bound disparate British communities under shared cosmological and moral frameworks. The spatial organization of this religious authority is revealed most clearly in the sacred topography of Britain, groves, islands, rivers, and monumental sites that define the geographic structure of Druidic power and prepared the stage for the insular cult centers that would confront Rome in the 1st century CE. The sacred landscape of pre-Roman Britain was organized through a network of monumental, natural, and ritual sites that encoded religious authority into geography. Archaeological and geophysical surveys reveal that cultic activity was distributed along patterns of visibility, proximity to water, and alignment with celestial phenomena. This integration of environment and ritual practice formed the physical foundation of Druidic influence. Unlike the urbanized temple complexes of the Mediterranean world, the insular religious topography was predominantly open air, defined by circular enclosures, avenues, and liminal features such as rivers and groves. The persistence of ceremonial activity at sites with Neolithic origins, most prominently Avebury, Stonehenge, and Stanton Drew, illustrates the long-term continuity between prehistoric ritual traditions and Iron Age priestly functions. Avebury, in present-day Wiltshire, exemplifies the transformation of prehistoric monuments into focal points of later cultic authority. The complex, consisting of a massive henge over 300 meters in diameter encircled by an outer ditch and bank, contained 2 internal stone circles and was intersected by the Kennet Avenue. Radiocarbon analysis places its primary construction between c. 2850 and 2200 BCE, but stratigraphic evidence of Iron Age reoccupation, including pottery sherds and hearths, demonstrates renewed use during the late 1st millennium BCE. The reappropriation of Avebury by Druidic elites is inferred from its continued prominence in the ritual landscape, likely serving as a gathering site for seasonal ceremonies tied to agricultural and astronomical cycles. The spatial configuration of the site, its circular symmetry and orientation, reflected the cosmological principles that underpinned Druidic theology, associating sacred geometry with the structure of time and order. Stonehenge, though earlier in origin, retained symbolic and possibly ceremonial significance into the Iron Age. Excavations led by Mike Parker Pearson, 2008 to 2019, identified Iron Age post holes and deposits of animal bone near the monument's periphery, suggesting that the site remained integrated into regional pilgrimage or ritual circuits. The solar alignments of the Sarsen trilithons with the midsummer sunrise and midwinter sunset correspond with the Druidic emphasis on calendrical regulation and astronomical observation attested in classical sources. While no direct evidence confirms Druidic rituals at Stonehenge, the continuity of usage and its association with celestial measurement position it within the intellectual framework that later defined priestly authority. Tacitus' mention of Druids performing rites in groves rather than temples does not exclude monumental participation. Rather, it implies a syncretic geography in which ancient monuments served as fixed cosmological markers amid otherwise fluid ritual practice. Local ritual centers, smaller in scale than the Great Henges, formed the operational infrastructure of insular religion. Excavations at Harlow, Essex, Hayling Island, Hampshire, and Fison's Farm, Suffolk, have revealed square and circular enclosures dating from the 2nd to 1st centuries BCE, characterized by internal altars, structured deposits, and evidence of repeated feasting. These sites likely functioned as district sanctuaries serving one or more tribes, under the supervision of local priestly lineages. The repetitive deposition of animal bones, ceramic vessels, and imported goods, often accompanied by the deliberate dismantling of weapons, suggests a regulated cycle of offerings governed by ritual law. Such practices would have required centralized coordination, reinforcing the Druids' position as administrators of sacred time and custodians of collective obligation. Natural features played an equally significant role in Druidic geography. Rivers such as the Thames, Witham, and Avon contained dense accumulations of votive material, including weapons, shields, cauldrons, and human remains, indicating their role as conduits between human and divine realms. Lakes and bogs, notably Elolwan Serrig Bach in Anglesey and Elolwan 4 in Glamorgan, yielded extensive ritual deposits spanning the Late Bronze and Iron Ages. These liminal waters were both sacrificial and judicial spaces. The deposition of valuables represented transactions with the divine, while human offerings, inferred from bog bodies such as those at Lindau Moss, may have served as acts of expiation or boundary sanctification. The Druids, as interpreters of ritual law, would have directed such ceremonies, determining appropriate sites, seasons, and forms of dedication. Sacred groves, nemata, constituted the most characteristic setting of Druidic ritual. Their distribution corresponds to regions of high settlement density and tribal administration. Later Roman references, such as Tacitus' description of the grove on Anglesey where the enemy lined the shore, their women in funeral dress, and Druids lifting their hands to the sky, imply that these groves were multifunctional centers combining worship, instruction, and assembly. Archaeobotanical studies at sites in Norfolk and Monmouthshire, revealing repetitive clearings and post-alignments within oak woodland, suggest managed ritual spaces rather than untouched forest. The grove thus served as a structured environment where nature and ceremony coalesced under priestly supervision. The integration of these varied loci, monumental, natural, and constructed, produced a hierarchical sacred geography. At the apex stood pan-tribal centers such as Avebury and Stonehenge, where interregional gatherings reinforced collective identity. Below them operated regional sanctuaries, functioning as administrative and educational hubs, while local groves and rivers provided accessible venues for regular rites. The Druids, occupying the highest stratum of this system, coordinated the ritual calendar, supervised sacrifice, and preserved the doctrinal coherence linking dispersed communities to a shared cosmology. Their authority was therefore spatial as well as intellectual. The geography of worship mirrored the hierarchy of priestly governance. The archaeological distribution of these sacred sites indicates patterns of territorial organization. Concentrations of ritual activity in Wessex, the Severn Estuary, and Anglesey correspond to areas later associated with political centralization and resistance to Rome. The recurrence of similar ritual forms across these regions, structured deposits, circular enclosures, solar alignments, demonstrates a standardized religious vocabulary. This homogeneity, achieved without centralized monarchy, attests to the coordinating influence of Druidic administration. Through control of ritual geography, the Druids established a network of authority that transcended linguistic and tribal boundaries, ensuring cohesion in an otherwise fragmented political landscape. The spatial uniformity of sacred practice in Britain finds its closest parallels in the continental sanctuaries of Gaul, where similar patterns of enclosure, deposition, and priestly oversight reveal a shared religious logic, suggesting that the insular and Gallic traditions formed a continuous system of Druidic governance across the Celtic world. Although Gaulish and British Druidism shared a common intellectual ancestry, they evolved into distinct institutional systems shaped by differing political, social, and environmental conditions. Classical sources such as Julius Caesar, Strabo, and Tacitus, when read alongside archaeological and linguistic evidence, suggest that while continental Druids operated within federated tribal confederations emphasizing legal and administrative authority, their insular counterparts assumed more pronounced religious and prophetic roles. Druidism, therefore, was not a single, monolithic priesthood, but a spectrum of regional traditions adapting a shared cosmology to local contexts. In Gaul, Druidic organization was interwoven with political confederation. The annual assembly near the Carnutes territory, described by Caesar, functioned as both a religious and juridical council, mediating disputes across tribes and enforcing ritual law. The Gallic Druids acted as legal scholars, arbitrators, and tax regulators, integral to the machinery of governance. Their authority derived from procedural knowledge, oral jurisprudence, and the capacity to sanction or excommunicate offenders from public rights. Such institutionalization implies a bureaucratic priesthood embedded in civic structures, comparable in some respects to the priestly colleges of Rome. In contrast, British Druidism developed in a more insular and geographically fragmented setting. The absence of large-scale confederations or centralized councils limited the Druids' administrative role and magnified their ritual and oracular functions. Tacitus' depiction of the Anglesey Druids as intermediaries between gods and warriors, invoking divine powers in battle, reflects this adaptation to a more tribalized society where spiritual authority substituted for political cohesion. Their power rested less on codified law and more on symbolic mediation, through prophecy, sacrifice, and the manipulation of sacred landscapes. Educational systems also diverged. In Gaul, Druidic training was highly stratified and potentially standardized. Caesar's account of students spending up to 20 years memorizing doctrine, cosmology, and law implies formalized instruction possibly concentrated at centers like Chartres or the Loire Valley. The continental Druids appear to have specialized. Philosophers in metaphysics, bards in poetic transmission, and vates in ritual execution. This division of intellectual labor mirrors the administrative sophistication of Gallic society. Britain, by contrast, presents less evidence for institutional schooling. Instruction likely occurred within smaller, lineage-based circles, with knowledge passed orally in family or tribal contexts. The topographical dispersal of ritual sites suggests localized traditions rather than centralized academies. The Anglesey complex, later described by Roman authors as a college of priests, may have been a late development in response to Roman encroachment, consolidating scattered orders into a defensive religious nucleus. Differences in ritual practice reinforce this regional contrast. Gaulish sanctuaries such as Gournay-sur-Arronde and Ribemont-sur-Ancre demonstrate standardized sacrificial rites involving the structured deposition of weapons and animal remains within enclosures, formalized, repetitive, and juridically supervised. British ritual, as evidenced by watery votive deposits, bog offerings, and the use of natural groves, retained a more animistic and decentralized character. The insular emphasis on sacred geography, solar alignments, and the veneration of local spirits points to a theology grounded in landscape rather than institution. In Britain, the Druid was less judge and more mediator between human and natural orders, a custodian of seasonal continuity rather than civic law. Politically, Gaulish Druids functioned as a stabilizing force, maintaining intertribal diplomacy and regulating warfare through collective edicts. Their suppression by Rome was as much an administrative strategy as a religious one, removing the intellectual infrastructure of Gallic unity. In Britain, the Druids' political influence was indirect but symbolically potent. Their association with kingship rituals, inauguration ceremonies, and oaths of alliance gave them ceremonial leverage over rulers. By the 1st century BCE, as continental Druidism faced Roman repression, British Druidism appeared to absorb a stronger eschatological and resistance-oriented tone, interpreting invasion through a cosmological framework of cyclical renewal and divine justice. Material culture corroborates this divergence. In Gaul, sanctuaries display increasing Roman influence by the late Iron Age. Stone temples, phantom, inscriptions, and syncretic deities merging Celtic and Latin attributes. Britain, isolated from direct Roman contact until the mid-1st century CE, preserved a purer form of indigenous ritual practice characterized by perishable materials and natural sanctity. This distinction would later manifest dramatically during the Roman campaigns under Suetonius Paulinus, when the destruction of Anglesey symbolized not only the conquest of territory but the suppression of an autonomous religious order. In essence, while both Gaulish and British Druids traced their authority to shared cosmological principles, belief in reincarnation, the sanctity of nature, and the power of the spoken word, their institutional forms diverged according to political ecology. Gaul developed a juridical and administrative priesthood integrated into a confederated society. Britain preserved a charismatic and visionary priesthood, rooted in ritual and prophecy. Together they represent the adaptive elasticity of Celtic intellectual culture, capable of both systematization and mysticism, law and vision. These regional distinctions would soon be tested under the expanding dominion of Rome, as both continental and insular Druidism confronted the imperial state, a contest not merely of armies, but of cosmologies, between rationalized empire and sacred law. The Roman confrontation with the Druids unfolded across two theaters, continental Gaul in the mid-1st century BCE and insular Britain in the mid-1st century CE, each reflecting the expanding administrative and ideological scope of Roman imperialism. In Gaul, Julius Caesar's Commentarii de Bello Gallico, composed between 58 to 50 BCE, provides the principal textual framework for reconstructing the interaction between Rome and the Druidic establishment. Caesar's campaigns, beginning in 58 BCE against the Helvetii and culminating in the suppression of the Gallic coalition under Vercingetorix in 52 BCE, systematically dismantled the institutional structures that had sustained Celtic autonomy. The Druids, whose authority had extended over judicial arbitration, religious coordination, and taxation, found their influence undermined by the imposition of Roman civic administration. Caesar's portrayal of them as both priests and legislators underscores their significance as intellectual custodians of Gallic unity, a factor that rendered them, from the Roman perspective, politically subversive. Archaeological evidence from sanctuaries such as Gournay-sur-Arronde and Ribe-Mont-sur-Ancre, destroyed or abandoned during the late 1st century BCE, supports the correlation between Roman military activity and the suppression of ritual centers. The sequence of Roman victories, from the seizure of Avaricum, 52 BCE, to the final capitulation at Alesia, correlates with the disappearance of high-status cult sites and a marked decline in large-scale votive deposition. Druidic assemblies, once held annually in the territory of the Carnutes, ceased to function as regional arbitration centers following the Roman reorganization of Gaul into provincii under Augustus, 27 BCE, 14 CE. The integration of Gallic elites into Roman administrative hierarchies further eroded the institutional base of Druidic authority. By the early 1st century CE, the Lex Provincii Gallii had effectively transferred juridical and fiscal powers from religious orders to imperial governors and municipally appointed magistrates. While continental Druidism faced systematic attrition through bureaucratic replacement, its insular counterpart encountered direct military assault. The invasion of Britain under Emperor Claudius in 43 CE, led initially by Aulus Plautius, marked the beginning of a prolonged effort to incorporate the island into the Roman imperial system. Classical authors, principally Tacitus, Annals 14.29-30, and Dio Cassius, Roman History LXII.6, describe the Druids as central figures in organizing resistance. Tacitus records that British Druids incited anti-Roman sentiment, performed sacrificial rites before battles, and interpreted omens to rally tribal confederations. Their perceived role as ideological unifiers rendered them a primary target of Roman military policy. The military operations culminating in the invasion of Mona Anglesey in 60 or 61 CE under Suetonius Paulinus illustrate the Roman approach to religious suppression as a means of political consolidation. Tacitus provides a detailed account of the campaign. Roman legions advancing across the Menai Strait encountered opposing ranks of Druids, women clad in black, and warriors invoking curses. A scene intended to intimidate the invaders. The Roman response was annihilative. Temples were razed, groves cut down, and sacred precincts desecrated. Archaeological remains on Anglesey, including burnt layers and weapon deposits at sites like Bryn Celli Ddu and Llyn Serigbach, support the historical plausibility of ritual destruction associated with this campaign. Following the subjugation of Mona, Roman garrisons were established to prevent the reconstitution of native religious assemblies. The Druids' resistance during both the Gallic and British campaigns reveals their dual function as religious intermediaries and political coordinators. Their authority derived from control over communication, law, and ritual sanction mechanisms that allowed them to mobilize tribal coalitions without formal military command. Roman commanders, recognizing the systemic nature of this influence, sought to eliminate the institutional foundations of Druidism rather than merely defeat individual tribes. The suppression of the Druids thus represented an ideological victory, the replacement of oral jurisprudence with codified Roman law, of regional cult systems with imperial civic religion, and of independent intellectual elites with state-sanctioned priesthoods. The logistical aspects of these campaigns demonstrate Rome's capacity for coordinated, multi-front operations. In Gaul, legions such as the Seven and X under Caesar operated in conjunction with engineered fortifications, supply depots, and roads that allowed sustained occupation. In Britain, the Roman military machine under Claudius employed a phased campaign structure, first securing southeastern tribal territories, then extending lines of control westward toward Wales. Both theaters employed a strategy of targeted cultural decapitation, the destruction of religious centers, confiscation of sacred relics, and deportation of priestly elites. By the end of the 1st century CE, Roman conquest had achieved the practical extinction of organized Druidic authority on the continent and had severely constrained it in Britain. Nevertheless, the persistence of anti-Roman revolts, such as Boudicca's uprising in 60 to 61 CE, possibly supported by surviving Druidic networks, suggests that suppression was neither instantaneous nor complete. Tacitus' account of prophetic declarations preceding the rebellion reflects the continuing symbolic power of Druidic ideology, even after institutional collapse. In administrative terms, the eradication of the Druids facilitated the standardization of Roman provincial governance. In Gaul, civitates were reorganized along urban lines, each governed by a curia of Romanized elites loyal to the empire. In Britain, following the defeat of native centers like Anglesey, temples to imperial cults were established, such as those dedicated to Claudius at Camulogenum, Colchester. These transformations effectively redefined religious authority as an extension of imperial loyalty. With their influence curtailed and sacred centers destroyed, the Druids entered a phase of systematic suppression, during which imperial edicts criminalized their rights and prohibited instruction in their doctrines, an era marking the transition from open confrontation to legal eradication. The destruction of the Druidic establishment on the island of Mona, modern Anglesey, in 60 to 61 CE represents one of the most explicit episodes of Roman religious suppression recorded in classical historiography. Tacitus' Annals, 14.29-30, provides the principal narrative, corroborated in part by Dio Cassius, Roman History LXII.6, depicting a calculated Roman campaign aimed not at territorial expansion, but at the eradication of a religious infrastructure regarded as a threat to imperial order. Anglesey was identified as the principal stronghold of the British Druidic hierarchy, functioning as a center for education, arbitration, and resistance coordination among the Western tribes. Its isolation, natural defenses, and symbolic prestige as a sacred landscape made it the focal point of anti-Roman sentiment and ritual legitimacy. The Roman governor Gaius Suetonius Paulinus, commanding Legio XIV Gemina and detachments of Legio XX Valeria Victrix, advanced westward after consolidating control over the Midlands. His objective was the neutralization of organized priestly leadership believed to incite tribal insurrections. The operation required a complex amphibious crossing of the Menai Strait, a narrow but treacherous channel separating mainland Wales from Anglesey. Tacitus describes the Roman troops' initial hesitation upon confronting an opposing force comprised not only of armed warriors but of Druids and women dressed in black, brandishing torches and chanting curses. The psychological intensity of this encounter was interpreted by Roman commanders as an indication of the island's ritual centrality and the cohesion of the religious order defending it. Following a brief period of disorder, Roman discipline reasserted itself. The legions crossed under covering fire from auxiliaries and systematically destroyed resistance. Tacitus reports that the groves, devoted to cruel superstitions, were cut down, and the natives slaughtered. The Latin phrasing, cru or captivo adolere eris, to make altars run with captive blood, indicates the Roman interpretation of Druidic rites as barbaric and sacrificial, justifying total annihilation. Archaeological deposits on Anglesey, including burned soil horizons at Lyn Serrig Bach and destruction layers near Bryn Celli Ddu, support the likelihood of widespread devastation during this period, though exact correlation with the campaign remains debated. The assault on Mona was not solely a military engagement but a targeted strike against a cultural nerve center. Druidic authority rested upon oral instruction, ritual continuity, and sanctified space. Once its physical base and priestly personnel were destroyed, the mechanisms of transmission collapsed. Tacitus explicitly states that following the campaign, the Druids' rites were prescribed and their meeting places abolished. The Roman response reflected a strategic understanding that political stability required the suppression of indigenous religious networks capable of mobilizing collective resistance. The timing of the assault, immediately preceding the Boudiccan revolt in eastern Britain, underscores this connection. With Anglesey attacked and its priesthood disrupted, the ideological leadership of the resistance was fatally weakened. Roman occupation policies following the suppression reveal a transition from annihilation to assimilation. The military governor established garrisons along the North Welsh coast to prevent the re-emergence of autonomous religious assemblies. Land confiscations were likely implemented to disrupt hereditary priestly estates, and Roman-style civic institutions were gradually introduced in adjacent regions, such as Saguntium, Carnarvon. The deliberate deforestation of sacred groves and the construction of military outposts signified the imposition of imperial spatial order over formerly sacralized terrain. These actions not only eliminated ritual autonomy, but symbolically redefined the landscape according to Roman concepts of authority and utility. Tacitus' narrative, though shaped by Roman moral rhetoric, provides valuable evidence of the perceived institutional depth of Druidism. His emphasis on the multitude of priests and their horrid ceremonies suggests an organized clerical body capable of exerting influence across tribal boundaries. The decision to prioritize its destruction, despite ongoing frontier instability elsewhere, indicates that the Druids were viewed not as a peripheral cult but as a systemic ideological opposition to Roman rule. Subsequent imperial decrees, such as those attributed to Tiberius and Claudius in Gaul, confirm the consistent Roman policy of outlawing Druidic practices across the empire. The suppression of Mona had enduring administrative implications. By eradicating the Druidic leadership, Rome eliminated the primary institution capable of articulating intertribal law and moral sanction. This allowed for the consolidation of provincial governance under Roman magistrates and the introduction of the imperial cult as a unifying religious framework. Archaeological traces of early Roman sanctuaries in northwestern Wales suggest the replacement of indigenous shrines with structures dedicated to Roman deities and emperors, reinforcing the ideological transition from native to imperial sovereignty. Although remnants of Druidic practice likely persisted in peripheral regions of Britain and Ireland, the destruction of Anglesey marked the effective termination of the institutional priesthood. Oral transmission without institutional infrastructure could not maintain its earlier cohesion or authority. Roman sources thereafter refer to Druids in Britain only as residual figures, isolated, politically irrelevant, and increasingly mythologized. With their central sanctuaries destroyed and their order proscribed, the Druids survived only in peripheral regions, adapting to concealment and localized ritual, ushering in a period of cultural fragmentation and residual continuity beyond direct Roman administration. Following the destruction of Anglesey and the formal prohibition of Druidic rites, the Roman administration in Britain and Gaul initiated a process of systematic integration designed to replace native religious institutions with state-sanctioned forms of worship. However, despite the suppression of their formal hierarchy, Druids and their intellectual traditions persisted in diminished, localized forms across peripheral and rural regions. The administrative consolidation of the provinces under governors and procurators did not immediately penetrate the cultural margins of empire, allowing remnants of the priestly class to survive by adapting their functions to new social frameworks. In Gaul, where Romanization advanced rapidly following the Augustan provincial reforms, Druidic survivals became embedded in rural religious practice. The Lex Provinciae Gallii standardized civic administration through civitates and curiae, replacing tribal assemblies with municipal councils. Yet archaeological and epigraphic evidence from rural sanctuaries, such as those at Lodonon, Corinth, and Mirbeau, suggests continued veneration of indigenous deities under Romanized names. The fusion of Celtic and Roman iconography, particularly in depictions of deities like Mercury, Teutates, and Epona, implies the participation of local religious specialists familiar with pre-Roman ritual frameworks. While these figures were no longer publicly identified as Druids, their roles as custodians of sacred sites, interpreters of omens, or officiants in agrarian rites point to functional continuity beneath administrative transformation. In Britain, Roman integration proceeded unevenly. Urban centers such as Londinium, Camulogenum, and Verulamium became nodes of imperial administration, but vast rural tracts in Wales, northern England, and western Scotland remained only loosely controlled. In these peripheral territories, remnants of Druidic practice appear to have persisted in association with local chieftains who accepted nominal Roman authority while maintaining indigenous cultural forms. Excavations at Llyn Cerrig Bach, as well as later ritual deposits in the northwestern zones, indicate that traditional offering practices continued intermittently well into the 2nd century CE. These rural sanctuaries, often associated with springs, groves, or standing stones, functioned as localized religious centers where ritual authority was exercised outside formal Roman oversight. The process of cultural syncretism was facilitated by the Roman policy of selective incorporation. The imperial administration tolerated native cults provided they did not challenge imperial sovereignty or public order. This flexibility allowed the transformation of Druidic functions into acceptable civic or domestic religious roles. Individuals formerly associated with the priesthood could continue as augurs, haruspices, or minor temple attendants within provincial frameworks. The conversion of sacred sites into phantom-type temples, rectangular enclosures with a central cella and surrounding ambulatory, reflects this accommodation. At sites like Ely and Nettleton, evidence of offerings combining Roman coins and indigenous votive objects attests to the coexistence of imperial and local ritual systems. Epigraphic sources also suggest residual intellectual influence. Inscriptions invoking divine wisdom or eternal cycles, in the Gallo-Roman context, may echo philosophical tenets once maintained by the Druids. The persistence of cosmological motifs, triple spirals, solar disks, and knotwork patterns on votive tablets and jewelry indicates the survival of symbolic frameworks reinterpreted through Roman artistic conventions. These motifs reappear in later insular art, implying an unbroken, if subterranean, transmission of religious iconography from the late Iron Age into post-Roman traditions. Roman literary evidence further acknowledges this endurance. Pliny the Elder, writing in Naturalis Historia, 16.95, observes that Druidic herbal practices and oak worship persisted even under the empire, though stripped of their former political stature. His comment illustrates how ritual practices detached from priestly institutions could continue as ethnographic curiosities tolerated within provincial folklore. The same applies to divination, augury, and healing rites, which Roman authors regarded as native superstitions rather than organized religion. Such continuity indicates that Druidic knowledge systems, particularly in medicine, astronomy, and oral memory, were not wholly extinguished but absorbed into vernacular practice under new guises. Geographically, the survival zones corresponded to the least urbanized regions: upland Wales, the Scottish Highlands, Armorica, Brittany, and parts of central Gaul. These areas, peripheral to major Roman roads and garrison centers, retained traditional kinship-based social organization. Without direct Roman municipal presence, ritual specialists continued to officiate seasonal festivals, agricultural blessings, and funerary observances. Their authority derived not from institutional sanction but from lineage and local reputation. Over time, this reduced but persistent priesthood became indistinguishable from the general category of rural wise men, healers, and poets, a social transformation marking the gradual dissolution of the classical Druidic order into folk religion. By the 2nd century CE, the administrative integration of the western provinces was effectively complete, but Roman influence remained concentrated in urban and military zones. Beyond these, the legacy of the Druids endured as a diffuse intellectual substratum, influencing oral traditions, seasonal customs, and proto-Christian cosmologies in later centuries. The resilience of Druidic concepts, cyclical time, sacred landscape, and the moral potency of knowledge demonstrates the adaptability of oral culture under conditions of political subjugation. As Roman governance solidified and overt priestly authority declined, the Druidic legacy entered a phase of transformation, persisting not through institutions but through the assimilation of its symbols, teachings, and cosmology into the evolving religious landscape of late antiquity. When Roman legions crossed into Gaul and Britain, they brought more than conquest, they brought law. The process of Romanization reshaped every stratum of Celtic society, from trade and settlement patterns to political organization and ritual life. With the establishment of Roman provincial administration, traditional institutions such as the Druidic councils and tribal assemblies lost their legal authority. Where Druids had once presided over disputes, levied tribute, and enforced customary law, Roman magistrates and governors now imposed a standardized imperial code. In Gaul, this transformation began almost immediately after Caesar's campaigns. The civitate system reorganized tribal territories into semi-autonomous units governed by local elites, often drawn from the same aristocratic classes that had once patronized Druids. These local leaders, known as principes or decuriones, were co-opted into the Roman civic order, serving as intermediaries between provincial governors and rural populations. Over time, the prestige associated with Roman citizenship and bureaucratic office displaced the sacred authority that Druids had long commanded. The heart of Druidic power, their jurisdiction over moral, legal, and ritual affairs, was deliberately undermined. Roman authorities recognized that Druids were not simply priests but functionaries of indigenous governance. Their control over law and education made them potential centers of resistance. Edicts issued under Tiberius and Claudius prohibited Druidic practice throughout the empire, explicitly linking their suppression to state security. Yet even where enforcement was uneven, the message was clear. Roman law was now the universal measure of order. Material evidence from this period illustrates the shift vividly. In urban centers such as Lugdunum, Lyon, and Augusta Treverorum, Trier, temples once dedicated to Celtic deities were rededicated to Roman ones, sometimes preserving native iconography under Latinized names. Stone altars bearing inscriptions to Mercurius Sasonius or Mars Camulus reveal how traditional religious concepts were reinterpreted within Roman frameworks. Similarly, civic basilicas and forums, venues for imperial justice, replaced the sacred groves and assembly fields that had once hosted Druidic arbitration. In Britain, the process was more gradual but equally profound. Following the conquest of southern Britain under Claudius, Roman administrators introduced urban centers such as Camulogenum, Colchester, and Verulamium St. Albans, complete with temples, forums, and civic courts. These institutions absorbed the social functions once fulfilled by Druids, offering a tangible demonstration of Roman law's reach. The famous Temple of Claudius in Colchester, both a symbol of imperial cult and a tool of political integration, stood as a deliberate counterweight to the old ritual centers at Anglesey and Salisbury Plain. However, the decline of Druidic jurisdiction was not purely coercive. Many Celtic elites found advantage in Roman institutions. Participation in imperial administration provided economic opportunities and a new avenue for prestige. The Latin language became a marker of sophistication. Literacy, once confined to Druidic memory and oral recitation, now found permanence in Roman script. The transformation of authority from spoken word to written decree marked a fundamental epistemic shift, from the oral law of memory to the codified law of empire. Yet traces of resistance persisted. In remote upland areas and western coastal regions, Wales, Armorica, and northern Scotland, Druidic traditions lingered as informal systems of arbitration and spiritual guidance. Archaeological traces of continued votive activity, including offerings in sacred springs and forest clearings, suggest that while their public role diminished, their religious and moral influence endured among rural populations. Roman writers occasionally noted these survivals with a mixture of fascination and disdain, portraying them as remnants of a bygone order. As Roman law replaced oral justice, another kind of transformation took root, a spiritual fusion. In the next section, we turn to how Druids and their followers adapted religiously within a Romanized world, merging Celtic deities and cosmologies with the gods of the empire. As the legions brought marble, law, and empire to Celtic lands, the Druids, once guardians of an oral cosmology, found new ways to speak through Roman stone. The decline of Druidic political power did not erase the religious world they had sustained. Instead, it transformed it. Across Gaul and Britain, a remarkable process of religious syncretism unfolded. Native gods were not abolished, but absorbed. The result was a hybrid pantheon where Roman and Celtic deities shared temples, attributes, and iconography, evidence of how deeply Druidic cosmology persisted beneath the surface of imperial religion. This fusion began with reinterpretation. Celtic divinities such as Lugus, Sucellus, and Epona were equated with Roman counterparts through the Interpretatio Romana, a framework by which Roman observers translated foreign gods into familiar forms. Lugus, the many-skilled deity of light and commerce, became Mercurius. Sucellus, the hammer-bearing god of abundance, merged with Silvanus or Dispater. Epona, protector of horses and fertility, stood alone as one of the few Celtic deities officially recognized in Rome itself. The persistence of these cults shows that Druidic theology, which had once been preserved in oral verse and sacred teaching, endured through adaptation. Temples of the Romano-Celtic type emerged as the architectural expression of this synthesis. These were not the grand peristyle temples of the Mediterranean but square or circular sanctuaries with central cella surrounded by ambulatories, forms derived from native wooden shrines and sacred enclosures. Excavations at sites such as Chartres, Ely, and Nettleton Shrub reveal votive deposits, inscriptions, and statuary blending Roman technique with indigenous symbolism. Gods were depicted in togas yet held torques, Roman eagles perched beside Celtic stags. Latin inscriptions invoked deities whose names still echoed from the Druidic age. Ritual practice followed a similar duality. Public sacrifices were now conducted in Latin, overseen by municipal priests or provincial officials, but the offerings, food, weapons, and figurines buried in watery or woodland settings retained pre-Roman forms. Springs such as those at Bath, Aquisulis, and Bourbon-les-Bains, D. Bormini, became centers of syncretic devotion. At Bath, the goddess Sulis was merged with Minerva, creating Sulis Minerva, a fusion that encapsulated both the Roman veneration of civic deities and the Celtic reverence for natural sanctuaries. The Druids themselves may have continued to play ritual roles as interpreters, healers, or local sages, subtly embedding their cosmology within the imperial cult's expanding system. Art and iconography carried this synthesis further. Reliefs from Trier, Autun, and Reims depict gods combining Roman posture and Celtic motifs. The Wheel of Tyrannies beside the thunderbolt of Jupiter, the cornucopia of Abundantia paired with the ram-headed serpent of Gaulish fertility. Even the imperial cult, with its emphasis on the divine emperor, found resonance in Celtic cosmology, which had long recognized sacred kingship and cyclical renewal. Thus, Roman worship did not simply replace the sacred. It reframed it, offering new forms through which old meanings persisted. This religious fusion also extended to mortuary practices. While Roman burial customs encouraged stone tombs and inscriptions, Celtic traditions of votive deposition and offerings to the otherworld persisted in rural areas. Hybrid tombs, blending Latin epitaphs with local symbols like the triskele or solar wheel, reveal how deeply the two systems intertwined. For common worshippers, the transition from Druidic ritual to imperial cult was not a rupture but a negotiation, one that allowed continuity of belief beneath the veneer of Roman civilization. In this evolving landscape, the figure of the Druid receded from view but did not vanish from memory. Their former roles as theologians, astronomers, and mediators found echoes in the learned classes that emerged under Roman influence: augurs, philosophers, and local clerics. What had been oral was now written. What had been hidden in grove and mist now found expression in temples of stone. Yet beneath the Latin inscriptions, the old Celtic soul remained, reshaped but not silenced. By late antiquity, these echoes would resurface in text. Roman and early Christian authors, from Lucan to Ammianus Marcellinus, would look back upon the Druids as symbols of a lost sacred wisdom, a memory that bridged the ancient and the mythic worlds. As Rome matured into empire and then dissolved into its successor kingdoms, the Druids lingered in the written imagination, relics of a priesthood no longer seen, but still cited. By the late 1st and 2nd centuries CE, references to Druids in Roman and early Christian literature shifted from ethnographic observation to historical recollection. The most comprehensive classical depictions, those of Julius Caesar, Diodorus Siculus, and Strabo, had already established the image of Druids as philosophers, judges, and theologians. Yet subsequent authors of late antiquity approached the topic with distance, viewing Druidism as an extinct or mythologized institution. This transition in textual tone marks the shift from living memory to antiquarian record. Pliny the Elder, writing in the Naturalis Historia, Book 16, 249–251, framed the Druids within a naturalist's catalogue. He described their reverence for mistletoe and oak, interpreting these rituals as part of a broader system of nature worship. His account, though derivative, marks the earliest Roman attempt to codify Druidic rites in empirical terms rather than moral ones. Lucan's Pharsalia, c. 61–65 CE, presented the Druids through literary imagination, situating them in the forests of Gaul as prophets contemplating the soul's immortality, a concept aligning with philosophical Stoicism. While Lucan's work was poetic rather than documentary, it shaped the enduring Roman perception of the Druids as mystical philosophers rather than political functionaries. By the 2nd century CE, texts by Pomponius Mela, De Choreographia, 3.19-20, and Tacitus, Annals, 14.29-30, had standardized the ethnographic canon. Tacitus, describing the assault on Anglesey under Suetonius Paulinus in 60–61 CE, portrayed the Druids as fanatical but organized, officiants in black robes performing sacrifices. This juxtaposition of ritual order and perceived barbarism persisted into late antiquity, influencing later Christian writers' attitudes toward native priesthoods. Archaeological evidence from this period corroborates the diminishing institutional presence of Druids. Inscriptions from the 2nd and 3rd centuries CE across Gaul and Britain make no direct reference to Druids as living officeholders. Instead, dedications invoke hybrid deities, such as Mercurius Sisonius, Mars Linus, and Sulis Minerva, signaling the absorption of sacred authority into Roman and local civic cults. The lack of Druidic titles in epigraphy indicates the suppression or assimilation of formal hierarchies, while the persistence of Celtic names in votive inscriptions suggests the survival of indigenous belief under Roman forms. In the late 4th century, as Christianity expanded into Gaul and Britain, the Druid became a rhetorical figure in theological discourse. Christian authors employed Druid as a symbol of pagan wisdom superseded by revelation. The anonymous Carmen de Mirabilibus Sancti Martini, late 4th century, equated Gallic sages with Druids in opposition to Christian saints, illustrating how ecclesiastical polemic transformed ethnographic description into moral typology. Similarly, the History of Ammianus Marcellinus, Book 15, c. 380 CE, referenced Druids only as philosophers of natural law, a distant echo of Caesar's account rather than an observation of living practice. The process of Christianization introduced a new dimension to the Druidic legacy. Church fathers and missionaries in post-Roman Gaul, such as Martin of Tours and Germanus of Auxerre, encountered vestiges of pre-Christian ritual in rural districts. Although their writings did not explicitly name Druids, the description of rural clergy maintaining rites at groves and springs, condemned in councils such as Alls 314 CE and Tours 567 CE, suggests continuity of Druidic-like religious functions within localized paganism. These paganist priests, active in the countryside, represent the last transformation of Druidic authority into folk religiosity before its eventual absorption into Christian symbolism. By the 6th century, scholarly compilations like Isidore of Seville's Etymology, Book 8.9, reference Druids only as ancient magi of Gaul, classifying them among the philosophers of the Gentile world. This marks the endpoint of the classical tradition. The Druid now belonged to the domain of antiquity, categorized alongside Chaldeans and Egyptians as remnants of a pre-Christian intellectual order. Together, these testimonies, literary, epigraphic, and ecclesiastical, reveal the gradual evolution of Druidic memory within Roman and Christian historiography. What had been a functioning priesthood became a symbol of native wisdom. What had once structured tribal law became a cipher for lost antiquity. By late antiquity, the Druids no longer acted, but were remembered, their institutional functions replaced by imperial magistrates, their rituals transformed by syncretism, their memory preserved by the very cultures that had once subdued them. As the Western Empire collapsed and Christianity advanced across the former provinces of Gaul and Britain, the Druidic legacy passed from record to legend. The next phase, the Christianization of the Celtic world, would redefine their image from philosophers of nature to relics of a vanished faith. Christianity transformed Celtic religious and intellectual institutions, displacing Druids from formal authority. Between the 4th and 6th centuries CE, the Christianization of the Celtic provinces of Gaul, Britain, and Ireland unfolded through a protracted sequence of administrative, political, and liturgical adjustments. Rather than a uniform or immediate transformation, the process reflected regional variations determined by Roman infrastructure, local elite participation, and continuity of indigenous institutions. Archaeological, textual, and epigraphic evidence collectively attest that conversion occurred incrementally, as former centers of Druidic influence adapted to new hierarchies of belief and governance. In Gaul, the earliest phase of Christianization coincided with the imperial endorsement of Christianity under Constantine, Edict of Milan, 313 CE, and the subsequent reorganization of ecclesiastical authority along Roman provincial lines. Episcopal sees emerged in major urban centers such as Lugdunum, Lyon, Arlate, Alls, and Trevorai Trier. The Passio Sancti Saturnini, early 4th century, records the establishment of Christian missions under episcopal supervision, often supported by Gallo-Roman elites seeking integration with imperial orthodoxy. Rural areas, however, preserved autonomous religious practices, evidenced by continued votive deposits at spring sanctuaries and dedications to hybrid deities such as Sulis Minerva and Mercurius Sisonius. Councils held at Alls, 314 CE, and Tours, 567 CE, repeatedly condemned paganist customs, rituals in groves, offerings at wells, and seasonal processions, indicating persistence of Druidic-derived local ritual well into the 6th century. In Britain, the process was complicated by political dislocation following the Roman withdrawal, c. 410 CE. The De Excidio et Conquestu Britanniae of Gildas, mid-6th century, described a society fragmented between Romano-British Christian enclaves and pagan or semi-pagan polities in Wales, Cornwall, and the north. Archaeological surveys at sites such as Lullingstone and Caerwent reveal 4th-century villa chapels coexisting with traditional shrines, suggesting overlapping religious practices. Inscribed Christian symbols, the Chi-Rho monogram and Latin crosses, appear on memorial stones in regions previously associated with Druidic ritual landscapes, implying repurposing rather than destruction of sacred sites. Ecclesiastical organization emerged first in urbanized southern Britain, while peripheral territories experienced delayed and syncretic forms of conversion, mediated through itinerant clergy and local kings rather than centralized episcopal authority. Ireland presents the most distinctive case, as it underwent Christianization without direct Roman administration. The earliest documentary evidence, the Confessio of St. Patrick, mid-5th century, depicts conversion as a negotiated process involving tribal chieftains and existing learned castes. Patrick's letters emphasize the recruitment of native elites and the adaptation of pre-Christian education systems for scriptural instruction. Later hagiographical sources, such as Tyrcan's Collectania, 7th century, preserve references to Phili and Druidi as figures encountered and sometimes converted by missionaries. Excavations at Tara, Emain Macha, and Cashel show early Christian ecclesiastical foundations established in proximity to former royal or ritual centers, reflecting an intentional continuity of sacred geography. The use of Ogham script in both pagan and Christian contexts demonstrates transitional literacy systems linking oral Druidic memory with the new written culture of the monasteries. Institutionally, the displacement of the Druids was less an eradication than an administrative reallocation of authority. Their former roles as arbiters of law, educators, and mediators were progressively integrated into Christian clerical structures. The Liber Constitutionum of the Council of Tours, 567 CE, prohibited clerics from consulting divinatores et sortilegos, a category encompassing residual Druidic practitioners, but the prohibition itself indicates their ongoing social function. Legal codices such as the Lex Salica, early 6th century, and the Bretha Nemd of Ireland, c. 7th century, preserved elements of oral legal tradition, possibly descending from Druidic jurisprudence. These compilations formalized precedents once maintained by memory specialists, substituting ecclesiastical literacy for oral authority. The transition also redefined educational systems. Druidic training, previously based on memorization and recitation of genealogies, laws, and ritual formulae, gave way to monastic schooling centered on Latin literacy, exegesis, and clerical administration. Yet, as the Historia Ecclesiastica Gentis Anglorum of Bede, completed 731 CE, later noted, the spread of Christianity in the Celtic lands preserved certain indigenous pedagogical practices, particularly the emphasis on oral recitation and mnemonic discipline. This indicates structural continuity in intellectual methods even as doctrinal content changed. Material culture from the conversion period reinforces this picture of synthesis. Cross-inscribed standing stones in Western Britain and Ireland, dating from the 5th and 6th centuries, often occupy earlier ritual enclosures or hilltop sanctuaries. Excavations at Ilan Luffin, St. Ninian's Cave, and Glastonbury demonstrate continuous use of ritual spaces through rededication rather than abandonment. The retention of seasonal festivals, Imbolc, Lugnasad, Samhain, reframed within the Christian liturgical calendar, further illustrates the gradual assimilation of Druidic ritual structures into ecclesiastical timekeeping. By the close of the 6th century, the Druids had ceased to exist as an identifiable priestly order, but the institutional mechanisms they embodied, oral transmission, ritual authority, local arbitration, and sacred geography, persisted under new nomenclature. Bishops, abbots, and monastic scholars inherited their administrative and intellectual functions, embedding them within the Christian hierarchy. The conversion of the Celtic provinces thus represents not an abrupt replacement, but a calibrated realignment of religious infrastructure, negotiated across generations through accommodation, adaptation, and eventual absorption. The integration of Druidic functions into Christian practice laid the groundwork for a distinct Celtic ecclesiastical identity. The next section examines how elements of Druidic knowledge, ritual, and pedagogy were preserved within monastic institutions and early medieval scholarship. Former Druidic authority persisted indirectly through the Christian Church. By the 6th and 7th centuries CE, the absorption of Druidic functions into the Christian ecclesiastical system had become structurally evident across the Celtic-speaking regions of Gaul, Britain, and Ireland. This process unfolded through administrative substitution, pedagogical adaptation, and juridical incorporation. Monastic foundations, episcopal sees, and missionary networks progressively assumed the Druids' social roles as arbiters, educators, and custodians of ritual law, ensuring continuity of governance under new theological frameworks. The replacement of Druidic legal authority occurred most clearly in the codification of native law under Christian auspices. In Ireland, the Brítha Nemd and Senchus Mór, compiled between the 7th and 8th centuries, represent the earliest written transcriptions of what had previously existed as an oral corpus of customary law. According to the prologue to the Senchus Mór, King Laeghaire and St. Patrick convened a committee of 9 scholars, including 3 bishops and 3 alums, learned men, to harmonize traditional legal precedent with Christian moral doctrine. The text explicitly acknowledges that these scholars preserved the judgments of the elders, a phrase suggesting direct continuity with pre-Christian legal memory traditionally maintained by Druids. The resulting compilation formalized case law, kinship rights, and compensation tariffs, integrating oral jurisprudence into a literate Christian framework without eliminating its indigenous structure. In Gaul, a similar process of assimilation is observable in the episcopal courts that emerged under late Roman and Merovingian administration. The Capitula Episcoporum and early Frankish synodi functioned as moral and legal tribunals, displacing earlier tribal assemblies once mediated by Druidic judges. The bishops of Tours, Arles, and Reims presided over judicial inquiries that combined Roman procedure with local custom, a synthesis documented in the Acts of the Councils of Orleans, 511 CE, and Tours, 567 CE. These ecclesiastical courts inherited not only the Druids' function as arbiters but also their local authority as representatives of divine law. The retention of vernacular arbitration formulas, recorded in the Formulae Merovingiae, demonstrates that oral traditions of dispute resolution persisted within Christian legal culture. Educationally, the monasteries of early medieval Ireland and Wales adopted pedagogical models closely aligned with pre-Christian learning systems. Druidic education had emphasized memorization through verse, cyclical repetition, and cumulative oral examination. Monastic schooling retained these methods, substituting scriptural content for cosmological or genealogical material. The curriculum of the early Irish monastic schools, Bangor, Clonmacnoise, and Armagh, combined Latin literacy with mnemonic instruction in law, poetry, and computation, reflecting pedagogical continuity. The Cain Adam Nain, 697 CE, promulgated by a Domnan of Iona, explicitly references trained reciters, Aethecthuatha, who preserved legal formulas orally, direct successors to the Druidic order's mnemonic specialists. Ritual and symbolic continuities also reinforced this absorption. Early ecclesiastical ceremonies incorporated elements of pre-Christian ritual geography, maintaining sanctity at wells, hills, and groves through rededication to saints. The Vita Sancti Columbi by a Domnan, c. 700 CE, records the Christian blessing of natural sites previously associated with pagan rites, transforming them into monastic dependencies without altering their communal function. The adaptation of Druidic ritual authority into Christian liturgy is further evident in the use of processional circuits, décile, seasonal observances aligned with agricultural cycles, and the continued veneration of sacred trees reinterpreted as symbols of the cross. These patterns indicate a managed transition wherein sacred topography and ritual choreography persisted under altered doctrinal supervision. Textual evidence from hagiography reinforces the notion of functional continuity. In the Vita Sancti Patriciae, Patrick's encounters with Druids, described as contests of miracles and knowledge, end not with the eradication of learning but with its redirection toward Christian theology. Later saints' lives, such as those of Bridget and Columba, portray holy men and women performing acts of arbitration, weather control, and healing within the same social contexts, once dominated by Druids. The Vita Sancti Samsonis of Dole, late 6th century, even describes monastic leaders presiding over assemblies of kings and judges, fulfilling a political mediatory role analogous to that formerly exercised by Druidic councils. Institutionally, the shift from Druidic collegia to monastic communities maintained continuity in corporate organization. Both relied on hierarchical orders of initiation, oaths of secrecy, and regulated instruction. The Regula Coenobialis of Columbanus, early 7th century, prescribed graded disciplines and memorized recitations, paralleling the initiation stages described by classical sources for the Druids. The monastic emphasis on obedience and internal hierarchy replaced ritual secrecy with moral discipline, transforming esoteric authority into pastoral governance. By integrating the Druids' social functions into ecclesiastical institutions, the Christian Church secured both legitimacy and stability in Celtic regions. The process was not iconoclastic but absorptive. Oral law became canon law. Sacred ritual became liturgy. Learned memory became exegesis. Archaeological continuity at sites such as Clonfert, Kildare, and Llanddewi Brefi, where early monastic churches occupy prehistoric or Iron Age ritual precincts, further illustrates the structural inheritance. By the 8th century, the term Druid had vanished from contemporary usage, but its institutional legacy persisted in the organization of Celtic Christianity itself. The monasteries became the new repositories of memory, the bishops the arbiters of law, and the saints the mediators of divine order. Through this process, the Druidic past was neither erased nor preserved intact. It was transformed into the intellectual and administrative substratum of a Christianized Celtic world. The assimilation of Druidic authority into Christian institutions ensured their survival in altered form. The next section examines late antiquity and early medieval textual references that reflect this evolving cultural memory and the redefinition of the Druidic figure within historical and theological literature. Druids' intellectual legacy endured indirectly in early Christian practice. As the institutional memory of the Druids faded from active practice, traces of their intellectual and ritual traditions resurfaced within the writings and customs of the early church. Patristic authors, those Christian theologians and historians writing from the 2nd to the 7th centuries CE, occasionally mention Druids as both relics of pagan error and figures of ancestral wisdom. The tone of these references was often ambivalent, condemning the Druids' theology yet acknowledging their intellectual discipline. Tertullian and Origen, writing from the Mediterranean sphere, invoked Druids as examples of northern philosophers, illustrating the universality of human attempts to discern divine truth. Later authors such as Isidore of Seville, composing his encyclopedic etymology in the 7th century, placed Druids within a typology of ancient learned orders, priests who interpreted natural and moral law before the coming of Christian revelation. These mentions reflect not direct knowledge but a symbolic inheritance, the Druid as the archetype of the pre-Christian sage. In Celtic-speaking regions, however, the connection was more immediate. In Ireland, monastic foundations such as Clonmacnoise and Iona arose within landscapes once central to Druidic influence. Early Irish hagiographies, lives of saints like Patrick, Bridget, and Columba, preserved echoes of confrontation and continuity. St. Patrick's Confessio describes encounters with magicians and Druids, yet later texts soften the opposition, portraying former Druids as converted teachers or counselors within Christian communities. Adamnan of Iona's Life of Columba, 7th century, recounts prophetic contests and visions reminiscent of Druidic divination, recast through Christian miracle narratives. Archaeological and linguistic evidence supports this thematic blending. The retention of sacred topographies, holy wells, groves, and hilltop sanctuaries into Christian worship illustrates a gradual sanctification of older ritual spaces rather than their erasure. Monks adopted local festivals such as Imbolc and Samhain, reframing them within the liturgical calendar as Candlemas and All Saints' Eve. This process of transformation rather than destruction defined Celtic Christianity's distinctive texture. Deeply local, environmentally attuned, and reliant on oral transmission of scripture and moral teaching. The continuity extended to pedagogy. Early Irish monastic schools, renowned for their memorization systems and poetic instruction, inherited techniques traceable to Druidic oral education. The structured recitation of verse, the encoding of moral law in rhythm and formula, and the communal composition of genealogies all echoed pre-Christian intellectual methods. Bards, once Druidic apprentices, continued to function as chroniclers and poets under monastic patronage, ensuring the preservation of collective memory in both secular and religious forms. Even theological discourse bore faint resonances of older cosmologies. The triadic expressions so characteristic of Celtic Christian writings, the threefold formulations of sin, virtue, or divine mystery, mirror the Druidic fascination with symbolic triads found in early Irish wisdom literature, Tréching Breth Fiann. Such survivals were not deliberate pagan retention but a reflection of how deeply ingrained intellectual patterns were within local thought. Christianity, rather than erasing the Druidic worldview, absorbed and recontextualized it within a universalizing faith. By the close of the 7th century, the term Druid had shifted from living practitioner to literary emblem. Poets invoked the word to denote wisdom, prophetic insight, or ancestral learning. What had once been a religious institution became a cultural symbol, a repository of memory through which Celtic Christians interpreted their own antiquity. The Church's victory over paganism thus coexisted with a quiet inheritance, the preservation of Druidic intellectual forms in service of a new theology. Moves into the medieval period, where the memory of Druids evolved from faint recollection into literary myth and national identity, setting the stage for their medieval reinvention. Druids survived in medieval memory as legendary figures embedded in literature. By the early Middle Ages, the historical Druids had vanished as a living institution, but their shadow persisted across the mythological and literary traditions of the Celtic world. In Ireland and Wales, monastic scribes recorded vast cycles of oral tradition that transformed the Druid from priest and jurist into prophet, magician, and counselor. What had once been a historical class of intellectual elites became a poetic archetype, embodying ancestral wisdom, divinatory power, and the continuity of cultural identity. In Ireland, the Leber Gabala Iren, Book of the Taking of Ireland, and other mytho-historical compilations written between the 11th and 12th centuries CE wove Druids into the genealogical fabric of the island. Within these texts, Druids served kings as advisors and seers, figures like Amergin, the poet-judge of the Milesians, who sings Ireland into possession through verse. The Druids here are both custodians of sacred speech and mediators between worlds, embodiments of divine order in human form. Yet these portrayals are no longer ethnographic recollections. They are literary inventions, refracted through centuries of Christian reinterpretation. Monastic authors, far from erasing pagan lore, preserved it through allegory. The Druids of medieval Irish sagas often mirror the role of biblical prophets. In tales like Tain Buachailnge, the cattle raid of Cooley, Druids appear as interpreters of omens and keepers of fate, paralleling Old Testament seers who announce divine judgment. This transposition allowed Christian scribes to conserve ancient motifs while aligning them with a theological worldview. The Druid thus endured not as a rival to the Church, but as a symbolic ancestor of inspired wisdom. In Wales, the Mabinogion and related prose cycles fulfill a similar function. Figures such as Gwydion and Taliesin, both poet-magicians, embody Druidic attributes: shape-shifting, prophecy, mastery of poetic form. The Haynes Taliesin, Story of Taliesin, in particular, recasts the poet as a vessel of divine inspiration, his knowledge encompassing the natural and supernatural alike. This fusion of bardic artistry with mystical insight mirrors the Druidic synthesis of law, ritual, and cosmology remembered in oral tradition. The survival of Druidic motifs within these medieval texts reveals how oral memory adapted under Christian stewardship. The scribes who compiled these narratives often framed them as pre-Christian antiquities, histories of Ireland and Britain before conversion. Yet, through their pens, Druidism became both romanticized and domesticated. The Druids were no longer lawgivers or priests but storytellers, sages and prophets, safe within the moral order of Christianized myth. Linguistically, the term Druid persisted in Irish and Welsh vocabulary well into the Middle Ages, signifying sorcerer or wise man. Its semantic shift from institutional title to general epithet reflects the broader cultural transformation. What had been an organized priesthood became a mythic category, part of the inherited symbolic language of Celtic identity. The Druids' role as keepers of memory thus continued, though now through literary and genealogical imagination rather than public authority. These mythological representations also reveal a deep nostalgia for lost autonomy. Written during a period when Ireland and Wales faced both ecclesiastical reform and external political pressure, the remembrance of Druids as ancient counselors and king's advisors served a cultural purpose. They became embodiments of a golden age, an age of native wisdom uncorrupted by foreign rule. This romanticized memory foreshadowed later medieval and even modern reimaginings of the Druids as national ancestors. Leads into an analysis of how fragments of Druidic legal and intellectual traditions persisted within medieval legal codes and social customs, demonstrating the subtle endurance of their institutional legacy. Elements of Druidic jurisprudence persisted in secular legal frameworks. While the Druids as a visible institution had faded by the early medieval period, echoes of their judicial and intellectual authority endured in Ireland's indigenous legal system, the Fenechas or Brehon laws. These codes, preserved through oral transmission and later recorded in monastic scriptoria between the 7th and 9th centuries CE, represent one of Europe's most sophisticated vernacular legal traditions. They stand as living testimony to a continuity of legal reasoning, social hierarchy, and ritual procedure whose roots stretch back to pre-Christian Celtic jurisprudence. The Brehons, or professional jurists, occupied a role strikingly reminiscent of the Druids. They were not simply judges in the modern sense, but mediators, legal philosophers, and custodians of communal ethics. Like their Druidic predecessors, they were trained through rigorous memorization and apprenticeship within hereditary schools. Knowledge of law, transmitted orally for generations before codification, was considered sacred property, guarded within learned lineages. The process of training often took decades, echoing classical accounts of Druidic education lasting 20 years or more. The Sanchez Mar, the principal compilation of Irish law, reflects a society governed by custom and moral precedent rather than royal decree. Within its structure lie vestiges of ritualized adjudication and sacral kingship, concepts that align with Druidic functions as interpreters of divine and natural law. For example, the emphasis on restitution over punishment, the symbolic use of oath and ordeal, and the notion of truth, as a cosmic principle all suggest a worldview rooted in spiritual order rather than mere social control. In this cosmology, law and nature were intertwined. Injustice was believed to disrupt both moral and cosmic balance. The persistence of these ideas indicates more than coincidence. It reflects an intellectual inheritance. Early Christian redactors of Irish law, such as the scholars associated with St. Patrick's mission, explicitly framed the Sanchez Mar as a purified system, ancient wisdom refined through Christian ethics. The narrative that Patrick himself approved the laws, except what was contrary to divine law, symbolizes an act of cultural negotiation, where pre-Christian legal philosophy was adapted rather than erased. Procedurally, the Brehon system also retained features consistent with Druidic practice. Legal disputes were often resolved in open-air assemblies or ritual enclosures, echoing the sacred groves described by classical authors. The role of the Olim, the highest grade of jurispoet, combined legal knowledge with poetic articulation, another continuity from the Druidic synthesis of word, law, and memory. These figures were bound by strict codes of honor and were often attached to noble households, serving as both advisors and educators. The Brehon laws also reveal the persistence of hierarchical knowledge and professional ethics. The jurist's word was binding, and deliberate misjudgment was considered a moral transgression with spiritual consequences. The law tracts describe penalties for false witness or untruthful ruling as violations against the very order of creation, concepts that parallel the Druidic notion of truth as an expression of universal balance. From an anthropological perspective, the endurance of these principles underscores how oral societies preserve continuity through adaptation. Even as Christianity reshaped Ireland's spiritual life, the mechanisms of Druidic jurisprudence were absorbed into secular institutions. The Church itself relied upon brehons for centuries in matters of local arbitration and property law, testifying to the system's durability. By the 12th century, when Norman legal systems began to penetrate Gaelic territories, the brehon order remained resilient, continuing to mediate conflicts, codify agreements, and uphold lineage-based justice. Their preservation of oral commentary and moral precedent, often delivered through verse, embodies a living legacy of pre-Roman intellectual culture in medieval form. The endurance of such institutions sets the stage for the next development, the literary and philosophical revival of Druidic imagery in medieval scholastic and poetic circles, where memory of the ancient priesthood was reconstructed in symbolic, romantic, and pseudo-historical form. Druids were transformed into symbols of knowledge and antiquity in medieval literature. By the High Middle Ages, Druids had ceased to exist as a functioning priesthood, yet they persisted vividly in literary imagination across Celtic and neighboring European cultures. Chronicles, genealogical compilations, and poetic texts increasingly depicted Druids as emblematic figures of wisdom, prophecy, and magical authority. This literary reconstruction often blended historical memory with mythic invention, reflecting both nostalgia for pre-Christian elites and the interpretive lens of Christian scribes. Geoffrey of Monmouth's Historia Regum Britanniae, circa 1136 CE, represents a seminal example of this process. Geoffrey reimagined Druids as royal counselors and seers, particularly in the courts of legendary kings such as Merlin, Myrddin, who synthesized Druidic foresight with prophetic Christian elements. In these texts, Druids are portrayed less as administrators or ritual specialists, and more as mediators of knowledge between the human and supernatural realms. Their authority is symbolic. It validates kingship, embodies ancestral wisdom, and provides narrative continuity connecting mythic prehistory with contemporary political structures. Welsh poetry, particularly the poems of Taliesin, compiled between the 12th and 14th centuries CE, preserves a parallel trajectory. Taliesin himself is depicted as a poet-prophet whose verbal mastery recalls classical descriptions of Druids as expert reciters and educators. The use of triadic motifs, mnemonic structures, and the articulation of natural and spiritual law within verse reflects an inherited intellectual style reminiscent of Druidic pedagogy. Druids in these poems are advisors, enchanters, and interpreters of omens, fulfilling roles aligned with collective memory rather than institutional function. Medieval Irish annals also contributed to this reconstruction. Texts such as the Annals of the Four Masters, 17th century compilation based on earlier sources, and the Liber Gabala Iren memorialized Druids as sages accompanying the Milesians and other legendary peoples. These narratives preserve genealogical and legal knowledge in symbolic form, depicting Druids as transmitters of cultural continuity. Their portrayal emphasizes intellectual mastery, legal insight, and the mediation of sacred knowledge, transforming historical priesthood into archetype. The literary codification of Druids during this period had broader implications for cultural memory. The divergence between historical reality and literary depiction widened. Historical Druids had functioned as jurists, ritual specialists, and educators. Medieval Druids, by contrast, were emblematic figures in chronicle, saga, and poetry. Christian chroniclers sanitized their pagan role, emphasizing wisdom, prophecy, and counsel while removing explicit ritual or legal functions. The texts, therefore, create a composite figure part cultural memory, part moral and political symbol. Moreover, this literary reconstruction laid the foundation for later early modern and Renaissance perceptions of Druids. Antiquarians and humanists, encountering these medieval accounts, interpreted Druids as emblematic of an ancient, philosophical Celtic elite. Poetic motifs, triadic structures, and narrative tropes from the Mabinogion, Liber Gabala Iren, and Geoffrey of Monmouth's chronicle directly influenced Renaissance works that positioned Druids as repositories of lost wisdom. This symbolic Druid became an intellectual ancestor, shaping the conception of Celtic antiquity across Europe. The process also demonstrates the role of textual transmission in preserving institutional memory. Even as Druids disappeared from political and religious life, the narrative function they occupied, custodians of knowledge, advisors to rulers, mediators of sacred law, persisted in manuscripts, poetry, and chronicles. The mnemonic and legal aspects of Druidic practice, once performed orally and tied to ritual spaces, were transformed into textual and symbolic forms accessible to later generations. The evolution from literary memory to antiquarian investigation sets the stage for early modern Druid revivals, where Druids were reimagined within historical, philosophical, and nationalistic frameworks. Antiquarian research reshaped the scholarly understanding of Druids. The 17th century witnessed a burgeoning interest in the material and textual remnants of pre-Christian Britain and Ireland, a movement that laid the groundwork for what would later be called the Druid Revival. Scholars and antiquarians sought to reconcile classical references to Druids with the visible archaeological record, particularly megalithic monuments such as Stonehenge, Avebury, and Carnac. Figures such as John Aubrey, 1626 to 1697, and William Stukeley, 1687 to 1765, engaged in meticulous surveys of these structures, producing detailed sketches, measurements, and comparative analyses in an effort to connect local tradition with historical authority derived from Greek and Roman sources. Aubrey's Monumenta Britannica, published posthumously, 1693, represents an early attempt to systematize knowledge of prehistoric monuments within a historical framework. Drawing on Caesar's Commentarii de Bello Gallico and Pliny's accounts, Aubrey proposed that Druids were responsible for the construction and ritual use of stone circles and burial mounds. While acknowledging gaps in the documentary record, he employed empirical observation, measuring diameters, alignments, and astronomical orientations to argue for a sophisticated, literate priestly class responsible for both ritual and astronomical knowledge. Aubrey's methodology combined field observation with philological analysis, an approach that sought to merge tangible evidence with classical testimony. Stukeley advanced this enterprise in the early 18th century through a combination of fieldwork, surveying, and imaginative reconstruction. His works, Avebury, A Temple of the British Druids, 1740, and Stonehenge, A Temple Restored to the British Druids, 1740, systematically interpreted stone circles and avenues as ritual centers of a learned priesthood. Stukeley emphasized geometric layouts, celestial alignments, and the ceremonial use of processional avenues, presenting Druids as custodians of both spiritual and practical knowledge. Although his conclusions were occasionally speculative, they represented a critical step toward integrating empirical observation with historical reconstruction. These antiquarians were influenced by classical texts, particularly Caesar, Diodorus Siculus, and Posidonius, which provided descriptions of Druidic education, judicial authority, and ritual practice. By aligning these textual sources with surviving monuments, scholars constructed a provisional chronology. The Druids were an elite priesthood overseeing public ritual, education, and social arbitration, whose influence spanned Gaul, Britain, and Ireland. This period of scholarship emphasized continuity between ancient textual references and local physical evidence, producing a scholarly framework that viewed Druids as historical agents rather than purely literary or mythological figures. The interpretive approach of 17th century antiquarians combined empirical methods with a degree of conjecture. Measurements of stone circles, observations of burial mounds, and comparison with continental Celtic sites were complemented by local folklore and genealogical accounts. Antiquarians collected oral traditions, noting place names, legends of priestly activity, and ritual continuity, which they correlated with classical testimony. While these sources were often fragmentary or ambiguous, their integration into a coherent narrative demonstrated the evolving methodology of early historical scholarship. Moreover, this scholarship reflected broader intellectual trends of the period, including the emergence of rationalist and empirical inquiry. Antiquarians emphasized observation, documentation, and replication of data, laying the foundation for archaeology as a systematic discipline. The Druidic past, once accessible only through classical commentaries or Christian hagiography, could now be approached through measurable, visible evidence in the landscape. This approach established Druids as subjects of historical study, emphasizing reconstruction based on physical and documentary traces rather than myth alone. These efforts also influenced perceptions of national and cultural identity. By linking Druids to megalithic monuments, antiquarians framed Britain and Ireland as inheritors of a learned and organized prehistoric civilization. Druids were depicted as precursors to learned elites, bridging pre-Christian societies with classical civilizations. This interpretation reinforced notions of continuity, valorizing ancestral wisdom while integrating empirical methods for verification. The empirical and textual foundation laid by 17th-century antiquarians prepared the way for the Romantic reinterpretation of Druids in the 18th century, where imagination, nationalism, and poetic idealization transformed Druids into symbols of cultural heritage and philosophical wisdom. Druids became cultural icons, blending fact and myth. During the 18th century, the image of the Druid underwent a profound transformation under the influence of Romanticism, antiquarian scholarship, and emerging nationalist sentiment in Britain, Ireland, and France. Writers, poets, and intellectuals reimagined Druids as proto-philosophers, educators, and custodians of ancestral wisdom. This period marked a shift from empirical reconstruction toward literary and ideological appropriation, as Druids became symbolic figures embodying cultural identity, moral authority, and philosophical depth. In Britain, Romantic poets such as William Blake, James Macpherson, and Thomas Gray drew upon both classical accounts and local tradition to portray Druids as sages attuned to nature and the cosmic order. Macpherson's Ossian poems, though largely fictionalized, popularized the vision of northern bards and Druids as repositories of communal memory and ethical instruction, blending poetic license with perceived historical authenticity. Gray's The Bard, 1757, dramatized the Druidic role in resisting conquest and preserving ancestral knowledge, reinforcing their image as moral and intellectual heroes within a nationalistic framework. Parallel developments occurred in France, where Druids were appropriated into Enlightenment and Proto-Romantic discourse. Antiquarians and intellectuals, influenced by Caesar and classical historiography, emphasized Druids' functions as educators, magistrates, and custodians of ritual, while framing them as precursors to philosophical and scientific inquiry. Voltaire and other philosophes referenced Druids as examples of indigenous rationality and societal organization, situating them within broader debates on civilization, religion, and governance. Druids thus became emblematic of an ancient, sophisticated cultural past that could inspire contemporary civic and moral reflection. Speculative reconstructions of Druidic ritual and ceremonial practice proliferated during this period. Writers and antiquarians combined empirical observations of stone circles and megalithic monuments with literary imagination to depict sacrificial rites, seasonal festivals, and initiatory ceremonies. William Stukeley's illustrations of Avebury and Stonehenge, already influential in the previous century, were disseminated widely, reinforcing the perception of Druids as central actors in both religious and social life. These representations, though rarely verifiable, shaped public understanding and fueled the Romantic fascination with the prehistoric past. Nationalist agendas also shaped Druidic memory. In Ireland and Wales, Druids were invoked as symbols of indigenous learning and resistance to foreign domination. Literary and historical discourses framed them as ancestors of the people, repositories of native law, poetry, and moral authority. The symbolic use of Druids as guardians of culture aligned with Romantic ideals of historical continuity, ethnic identity, and collective memory, providing a sense of rootedness amid social and political change. The period also witnessed an increasing tension between myth and emerging historical critique. While Druids were celebrated in poetry and literature as moral and philosophical exemplars, antiquarians began to question the historical accuracy of these romanticized accounts. Nevertheless, The literary and symbolic power of the Druid remained central to 18th-century cultural imagination. By conflating observation, classical texts, and imaginative reconstruction, writers created a Druidic figure that was simultaneously historical, legendary, and ideological. The literary and ideological reinvention of Druids set the stage for 19th-century archaeological investigation, critical historical assessment, and the emergence of modern scholarly approaches to understanding their historical reality. Scientific archaeology clarified the historical reality of Druids while retaining cultural fascination. By the early 19th century, systematic archaeological investigation began to challenge the largely romantic and antiquarian narratives surrounding Druids. Excavations at Stonehenge, Avebury, and other megalithic sites in Britain and Brittany employed stratigraphic observation, measured surveys, and artifact analysis, establishing empirical frameworks for understanding prehistoric societies. Scholars such as Sir Richard Colt-Hoare, William Cunnington, and later Augustus Pitt Rivers documented earthworks, barrows, and burial contexts, emphasizing chronology, construction techniques, and material culture over mythic or literary associations. These efforts gradually distinguished between Druidic legends and tangible evidence of Bronze and Iron Age ritual activity. Archaeological research revealed that many monuments previously attributed to historical Druids actually predated the Celtic expansions described by classical authors. Radiocarbon dating, typological analysis of ceramics, and alignment studies indicated that major megalithic structures, Stonehenge, the Avebury complex, and the Karnak alignments, originated in the Neolithic and early Bronze Age, centuries before the period in which Druids were active as priestly elites. Consequently, earlier assumptions linking Druids directly to these sites were reevaluated, highlighting the persistence of romantic and nationalist projections rather than historical continuity. Despite this growing empirical rigor, literature and folklore continued to influence public perception. Popular histories, travelogues, and poetic works reinforced the idea of Druids as custodians of monumental landscapes, ritual knowledge, and sacred authority. Writers such as John Leland and later Victorian antiquarians incorporated both scientific findings and imaginative reconstruction, presenting Druids as intermediaries between prehistoric ritual and Iron Age society. This duality, evidence-based archaeology alongside enduring myth, underscored the tension between scholarly assessment and cultural fascination. Modern excavations also refined understanding of Druidic chronology, function, and societal context. In Britain and Gaul, contemporary studies integrated archaeological finds with classical textual sources, including Caesar, Diodorus Siculus, and Tacitus, to reconstruct the socio-political and religious frameworks in which Druids operated. Settlement patterns, hill forts, and ritual enclosures were correlated with accounts of tribal federations, sacred assemblies, and Druidic education. Evidence of long-term occupation, craft specialization, and trade networks clarified the economic and administrative structures supporting Druidic influence. Furthermore, osteoarchaeology and funerary analysis provided insight into social stratification, age cohorts, and ritual practice. Burial deposits associated with ritual enclosures occasionally contained high-status goods, bronze implements, decorated swords, and ornamental jewelry, indicating that elites with specialized roles maintained social authority consistent with descriptions of Druidic hierarchies. While direct identification of individuals as Druids remains impossible, these material indicators offer empirical grounding for understanding the elite priestly class described in classical texts. This period also witnessed methodological debates concerning interpretation. Scholars emphasized the necessity of distinguishing legend from data, while acknowledging that folklore and literary tradition preserved aspects of social memory. Druidic myths, though historically inaccurate in many particulars, reflected enduring narratives of intellectual, legal, and ritual authority. As a result, modern scholarship treats Druids as historical actors, constrained by material evidence, while recognizing the powerful cultural legacy constructed over centuries. The reconciliation of archaeological evidence, classical accounts, and folklore establishes the foundation for contemporary scholarly consensus, comparative analysis, and understanding of Druids within the broader Celtic and European context, forming the focus of the concluding chapter. Archaeology confirmed that Druids were historically grounded, not purely mythical. The 19th and 20th centuries saw a marked expansion of systematic archaeological fieldwork across Britain, Ireland, and continental Gaul, providing unprecedented material insight into the societies in which Druids operated. Excavations at key ritual and settlement sites, including Stonehenge, Avebury, the Boyne Valley, Carnac, and numerous hill forts in southern Gaul, documented a combination of ceremonial enclosures, burial mounds, and artifact assemblages that corroborated classical accounts of elite, specialized priestly activity. Researchers such as Augustus Pitt Rivers, Sir Mortimer Wheeler, and more recent teams employing stratigraphic, typological, and radiometric methods produced detailed site reports, offering evidence of complex social hierarchies and organized ritual practice. Ceremonial sites often included long enclosures, timber circles, and stone alignments, frequently associated with high-status deposits. Excavated artifacts reveal a pattern consistent with specialized religious functions. Finely crafted bronze tools, ceremonial swords, ritualized feasting implements, and votive objects. High-resolution analysis of metallurgical composition and stylistic motifs confirms that many items were products of elite artisan workshops, implying patronage by socially prominent figures such as Druids. Osteological analysis of interments demonstrates selective treatment of individuals, suggesting differentiated social status aligned with roles described in classical sources. In Ireland, systematic excavations of ring forts and ecclesiastical sites uncovered continuity of settlement patterns from the late Iron Age into early Christian contexts. The presence of ritual deposits, including animal remains, votive offerings, and carefully arranged grave goods, provides material evidence for structured ceremonial activity, aligning with textual references to Druidic feasts, sacrificial rites, and sacred assemblies. Such findings reinforce the interpretation that Druids functioned as intermediaries between social, religious, and political spheres, overseeing both ritual and legal obligations. In Gaul, surveys and excavations of oppida and sanctuaries, including Gournay-sur-Arronde and Entremont, reveal architectural and material evidence of centralized, hierarchical religious activity. Structures interpreted as learning centers or sanctuaries include high-status dwellings, assembly spaces, and cultic deposits, reflecting a social infrastructure capable of supporting a specialized priestly class. Inscriptions, when present, document names, dedications, and occasionally ceremonial instructions, lending further credence to the historical reality of institutionalized elite knowledge. Advancements in excavation methodology during the 20th century, including aerial photography, geophysical survey, and radiocarbon dating, allowed for precise chronological placement of sites. Alignment studies demonstrated intentional astronomical orientation of key monuments, reinforcing classical claims regarding the Druids' observational and calendrical expertise. Artifact distribution analysis, combined with settlement patterning, corroborated the notion of regional hierarchies in which Druids likely mediated social, religious, and legal functions. This period of research also emphasized context. Finds were interpreted not in isolation but within their broader landscape, integrating environmental, economic, and social dimensions. Ritual deposits were often associated with trade networks, agricultural cycles, and intertribal relations, illustrating the Druids' embeddedness in systemic governance rather than isolated spiritual practice. The material record thus confirms that Druids were not solely literary or mythological constructs but functioned as historically grounded actors within Iron Age Celtic societies. Critically, the combination of excavation data with classical literary sources, including Caesar, Diodorus Siculus, and Posidonius, enabled refined reconstructions of Druidic organization. Evidence supports descriptions of multi-decade training, hierarchical education, and judicial responsibilities. The distribution of ritual centers and elite deposits suggests both local and supralocal authority, consistent with reports of Druids mediating between tribes and exercising influence over political assemblies. The material and textual synthesis established by 19th and 20th century archaeology enables comparative analysis across Celtic and broader Indo-European contexts, forming the basis for contemporary scholarly consensus on Druidic institution, function, and social integration. Druids exemplify broader patterns of elite ritual and juridical specialization. Contemporary scholarship situates the Druids within a comparative Indo-European framework, analyzing linguistic, social, and ritual patterns to understand their historical role and persistence. Cross-cultural studies reveal that priestly elites specializing in religious, judicial, and educational functions are characteristic of early complex societies across Europe and Asia. Within the Celtic context, Druids served as intermediaries between the sacred and secular, exercising authority in both spiritual guidance and legal mediation, reflecting broader Indo-European norms of learned priesthood. Linguistic evidence contributes to this comparative approach. The term Druids, Greek, Druids, Latin, Druidi, derives from the Proto-Celtic Druides, interpreted as oak knower or one who knows the oak, indicating an early association with sacred groves and arboreal symbolism. This etymology parallels Indo-European priestly terminology, in which natural elements often signify ritual authority or cosmological insight, as seen in Vedic I, sage, and Germanic Gothi, priest. The lexical continuity emphasizes the integration of nature, law, and learning in elite functions across related cultural traditions. Anthropological analysis of social structure further situates Druids within elite hierarchies. Classical sources describe multi-tiered education, initiation, and hierarchical rank features mirrored in other Indo-European priestly orders. For example, Vedic Brahmins underwent decades of oral training in law, ritual, and astronomy, paralleling the Druidic emphasis on memory, oral jurisprudence, and ritual mastery. Similarly, early Germanic and Baltic priesthoods maintained hereditary or semi-hereditary roles, mediating between community, ruler, and the sacred. These analogies demonstrate that Druidic authority conformed to systemic patterns of ritualized knowledge specialization prevalent across Indo-European societies. Ritual and ceremonial parallels are equally instructive. Excavated Iron Age sanctuaries, megalithic alignments, and sacrificial deposits indicate practices combining seasonal observances, feasting, and divinatory activities. Similar patterns are observable in Indo-Iranian, Italic, and Slavic contexts, where priestly elites maintained calendars, adjudicated disputes, and oversaw offerings. The Druids' integration of education, law, and ritual thus reflects a widespread model of elite specialization that facilitated social cohesion, codified moral and legal norms, and preserved communal memory. This comparative perspective clarifies the persistence of Druidic functions even amid political and religious transformation. As Celtic societies encountered Roman, Christian, and later medieval influences, the underlying structural roles, legal mediation, ritual oversight, and educational authority remained intelligible and adaptable. The adaptation of these functions into Brehon law, monastic pedagogy, and literary tradition demonstrates the durability of a socio-religious model common across Indo-European cultures. Archaeological, textual, and comparative evidence converge to highlight the Druids' institutional significance. They were not marginal magicians or folkloric constructs, but socially embedded elites whose authority was codified, replicated, and transmitted over generations. Comparative anthropology situates them within a global framework of ritual specialists, illustrating that the Celtic priesthood exemplified universal patterns of human social organization, particularly in managing knowledge, law, and ritual authority. These comparative insights provide the foundation for contemporary scholarly interpretations, integrating archaeological, textual, and anthropological evidence into a cohesive understanding of Druids in historical and cultural context. Today, Druids are understood as a historically verifiable institutional class. Contemporary scholarship integrates multiple lines of evidence: archaeological, classical textual, and comparative ethnographic, to produce a nuanced understanding of Druidic institutions. Archaeological excavations across Britain, Ireland, and Gaul confirm the presence of elite ritual sites, specialized artifacts, and high-status interments consistent with the social role described in classical sources. Excavated ceremonial tools, Votive deposits and architectural layouts demonstrate the spatial and material dimensions of Druidic practice, while radiocarbon dating situates these activities firmly within the Iron Age, corroborating timelines derived from historical accounts. Classical authors, including Julius Caesar, Diodorus Siculus, and Posidonius, provide detailed descriptions of Druids as educators, judges, and ritual specialists. Their accounts emphasize hierarchical training, oral law, and mediation of both sacred and civic authority. Modern scholarship critically evaluates these texts, recognizing both ethnographic insight and potential biases. Caesar's portrayal of Druids, for instance, served political purposes by emphasizing their influence during military campaigns. By triangulating such accounts with archaeological evidence, historians reconstruct Druidic authority as institutional and socially embedded rather than purely symbolic. Comparative anthropology situates Druids within a broader Indo-European framework, emphasizing structural analogies with priestly classes elsewhere, such as Vedic Brahmins or early Germanic and Italic priesthoods. These parallels reinforce the interpretation of Druids as a learned elite responsible for legal, ritual, and educational functions. Linguistic analysis, including Proto-Celtic terminology, confirms the symbolic and cosmological dimensions of Druidic knowledge, particularly the integration of nature, memory, and law. Modern scholarship also addresses the role of oral transmission. Druids relied on multi-decade education and memorization of law, genealogies, ritual procedures, and astronomical knowledge. While no written Druidic records survive, the continuity of legal, ritual, and poetic structures, evident in Brehon law, monastic pedagogy, and medieval literary memory, demonstrates the effectiveness of oral instruction and institutional continuity. Regional variation is also emphasized. Druidic practices adapted to local polities, sacred landscapes, and social hierarchies, resulting in differences between Gaulish, British, and Irish contexts while maintaining core functional characteristics. Literary and folkloric accounts are treated critically as sources for cultural memory rather than literal history. Medieval chronicles, Welsh poetry, and Renaissance texts reveal how Druids were mythologized as wise counselors, magicians, or national symbols. While these sources are invaluable for understanding the long-term cultural perception of Druids, scholars distinguish between literary reconstruction and empirical evidence, allowing for a synthesis that respects both historical reality and cultural legacy. Contemporary interpretations emphasize the Druidic combination of priestly, judicial, and educational roles. Druids functioned as intermediaries between social groups, adjudicators of law, educators of elite youth, and overseers of ritual practice. They operated within hierarchical and institutionalized structures, exerting influence across tribal federations, regional polities, and sacred landscapes. Archaeological data, classical texts, and ethnographic comparison collectively demonstrate that Druids were historically verifiable agents embedded in Iron Age Celtic society. Concluding the historical sequence, this understanding highlights the continuity, adaptation, and legacy of Druidic institutions across Iron Age Europe, through Roman occupation, Christianization, medieval memory, and modern scholarly reconstruction. If you found this journey through the world of the Druids illuminating, consider subscribing for more deep dives into ancient civilizations, empires, and forgotten histories. Hit the bell to never miss an exploration of the past that shaped our world.